Night in the little Irish town gathered itself like a cloak, and the lanes where rushes grew fell quiet, except for the shy shuffle of hares and the far, tired song of the sea. Above it all, a fog unrolled from the fields, and touched the hedges with damp fingers, as if the land itself wished to whisper but not be seen. At the meeting of four paths, one to the bog, one to the hills, one to the chapel with its bell that rang even when the wind did not, and one to the inn, where coins clinked like nervous teeth, there stood a man with a grin as narrow as a knife, Jack, whose pockets pinched, whose hands knew how to hold and not to give, whose charm could buy a minute of goodwill, while his thrift took an hour away. He had the air of someone who carried a secret ember in his chest. It warmed him alone, and lit nothing for others, yet he was proud of its glow. The tavern behind him exhaled peat smoke and laughter. The signboard creaked like an old sailor, glass winked, boots thudded, and a fiddler coaxed a tune that remembered better days. But Jack waited at the crossroads because some men caught fortune, and some men, like him, caught the moment that will let fortune be tricked. The fog loved the lanes tonight. It curled around the milestone, tasted the ivy on the chapel wall, and pooled, ankle-deep, over the ditch where cattails slept. Even the moon, nettled by cloud, wore a gauze veil and would not argue with earth. It was a night for bargains, those soft-footed agreements that slip between words and bind harder than iron. Jack's eyes, sly and bright, followed the shimmer of each lantern across the green. When one traveller raised his light, the fog drank it and returned only a pale sip. When another stamped the dew from his boots, the ground sighed like a contented cat. Jack chuckled to himself. "Now then," he murmured, "let's see who comes to share a drink and pay the bill." He had a way of setting traps with smiles. He held them open long enough for someone else's vanity to step in. He closed them with a compliment. To many, he was just a rogue with a nice story and an emptier coin purse than he claimed. To a few, he was a puzzle you could never quite solve, a man who could stop the room with a joke and leave it thinking he'd done you a favour. What he did not speak of, even to his reflection in the barrel outside the inn, was the peculiar stillness that sometimes came to stand beside him, like a person made of weather, part chill, part fragrance of ash. Out at the crossroads, it did not always come, but on nights when the calendar wore thin, when October remembered the old name Samhain, and the after-harvest fields remembered they had once been forests where spirits walked, the stillness would arrive and lean against the signpost, as if waiting to be introduced. Tonight it arrived with a breath of apples, a faint clatter of hooves no horse had made, and the sense that the road itself had smiled. Jack did not startle. He had the unflattering courage of the very stingy. Fear is expensive, and he seldom paid for it. "Good evening," he said to no one, and to the someone he could not quite see. A colder night than yesterday. Perhaps it could be warmed. The fog, delighted, made room for a shape like a gentleman's outline, a coat of a style a year too fine for local fashion, boots that had walked more than cobbles, and a face whose handsomeness depended on the angle. Straight on it pleased, in profile it promised, and in shadow it warned. His smile knew old songs. "Warmed," the newcomer agreed, voice smooth as a poker drawn from coals. "A generous thought, Jack." The name brushed Jack's ear like a moth's wing. Of course the stranger knew it. Names have a way of wearing thin in small towns, and Jack's had been mended with gossip so many times it barely held. He warmed his own voice as best he could. "If a man would sit with me," he said, gesturing toward the tavern door, where lamplight lay like a tame dog, "I'd not deny him company, provided the drink is good, and the company is better." The stranger's glance went to the signboard, to the windows puffing warmth, to the doorknob that wore the day's fingerprints. They say your company is best after the third cup, he observed, and your tab is best when someone else pays it. Jack laughed, not too loudly, for laughter should not frighten luck, and not too softly, for luck admires a confident man. What is money? He asked the fog, if not a trick we play on each other until the dawn calls our bluff. The stillness beside the signpost, like that, it hummed a little. The gentleman's eyes glinted like stones at low tide. All right, he said, let us have a drink, and let us have it on my coin. In the mind of every careful listener on nights like this, a bell rings, once distinctly, though no bell rope moves. Jack heard it. He also heard, under the gentleman's easy promise, the iron rasp of a condition yet to be spoken. He knew the kind of men who paid quickly. They were either fools or collectors. Fools have soft hands and harder consciences. Collectors have patient hands and no conscience at all. Jack decided the stranger was no fool. Then come, he said brightly, and may this fog never find us stingy with laughter. The door swung wide. Warmth rose. The fiddler's tune stepped closer to a jig. Cups knocked. Barman nodded. Peat smoke told stories about hills that would be there long after men stopped arguing about them. The stranger stood beside Jack at the counter, and the two of them were a picture people. Remember, long after they forget what was said, the local scamp with his lantern ash grin, and the polished traveller whose smile was a hinge on an unseen door. They drank. The first cup tasted of earth and hearth, the second tasted of the river that cooled the still, the third warmed the wrists, loosened the tongue, and put a polite blush on truth. Jack told the kind of anecdotes that sound harmless until the end, where the harmlessness turns out to have charged a fee. The stranger listened as if each word might be a coin he would later stack in order of their shine, and when the barman wiped his hands and cleared his throat, when the bill peered shyly from under his palm like a mouse from a wainscot, Jack tilted his head into the same innocent angle he had used on half the parish. Ah, he said, this is the moment that separates friends from acquaintances, legend from rumour, and generosity from the rest of us. The stranger's smile widened, not kindly, not unkindly, only inevitably. Don't trouble yourself, he murmured. I've a coin for that. The room quieted around them in the way rooms do when the wind changes direction outdoors. Jack's grin did not move at all. It remained a narrow crescent, careful as a sickle. Some say he saw, just then, beneath the gentleman's cuff, a flicker of something that was not fabric. Some say he smelled a coal fire that had no chimney. He only reached across the counter and set down one finger, as if pinning a moth by its shadow. A coin is a blessing when it is what it seems, he said softly. But have you ever held a coin that wasn't? And this is where the fog leaned closer. The signboard held its creak like a breath, and the stillness at the crossroads smiled in recognition, for a wager had been set in motion, not with thunder, but with the quiet click of an idea in a stingy man's mind. The barman's palm hovered, shy as a moth over lamplight, and the bill peeped out again, but the stranger only smiled with that hinged smile and rested two fingers on the counter, as though feeling for a pulse in the wood. A coin glimmered there, not dropped, but arrived, the way a thought arrives when the mind has been standing at a window too long. The room watched. Yes, even the smoke seemed to pause mid-curl, and Jack felt that little ember in his chest purr with interest. He had made a life of coaxing other men's pride into paying for his pleasures, and it always began with the same lesson. Pride loves to perform. A rare coin, he observed softly, as if speaking to the wind. Fit for a story, and a story fit for a long night. The gentleman's eyes flickered like a hearth deciding how brightly to burn. Rarer than you think, he said, and he tipped the coin just a little to catch the candle's face. Some saw a king's profile, some swore they saw a thorn-crowned shade, others claimed there was no face at all, only a deepness like a well, and at the bottom of it a single spark. Jack did not reach for it. He sipped, he joked, he let the stranger pay the first reckoning, and the second, for generosity, like rain, is best accepted in steady weather. But when the third set of cups had sweated in the warmth, and the fiddler's tune had softened into something that remembered winter, Jack half turned and sighed as if to himself. If only coins obeyed, as words do. If one could ask them to change, even for a moment, we might all see how thin their magic is. It was an invitation the fog understood, for it pushed its cool nose at the door jamb. It was a dare the gentleman heard, for his smile grew both kinder and colder, like starlight in a well. "Would you have a demonstration?" he asked lightly. Jack's own smile scarcely moved. It was a rope bridge tested by a careful foot. If a gentleman could make a coin that was not a coin, only for a breath, he murmured, why, he'd scatter astonishment like seed. The barman would talk of it for years. The parish would lean in closer to their hearths. Even the October hedges would lift their heads to listen. The gentleman did not look at the barman, nor at the parish, nor at the hedge. He looked at Jack, and in that look was a promise that did not require thunder to be believed. He turned his wrist, and, how else to say it, the space his fingers held became coinness itself, a weight and a shine, a small sun tethered to a world of buying and owing. The coin lay there, perfect as a lie told for love. Jack's breath did not change. He admired it as a cat admires a bird, politely with a calculation that keeps time to the flutter. Then, so casually, he seemed to be remembering a song he'd once known. He said, "If it pleases your honour, make it smaller, small enough to hide." And he opened his hand. A hush walked through the room. The fiddler's bow did not quite touch the string. Somewhere a knot in the beam popped like a soft knuckle. The gentleman tilted the coin, and it shrank as dew shrinks from noon, bright and obedient. "Smaller," Jack coaxed, as if he were speaking to a flame he meant to shelter. "Thin as a promise, bright as a story." The coin obliged. Then, with a laugh that would have sounded merry if not for the iron underneath, Jack closed his fingers around it. For a heartbeat, the tavern thought the trick ended there. But Jack's hand, calloused, ash-scented, not unkind, did not unclasp. He slid that hand into his coat, where a tiny iron cross lived, like a stubborn thought stitched into a seam. And when his fingers opened again, it was around a glittering prison he had made, without a word. The gentleman's smile remained, but it had to work for a living now. "Ah," he said softly, as though complimenting a craftsman whose cunning he had recognized too late. "A righteous shape." Jack bowed, something between gratitude and apology. "In a town like this," he murmured, "iron has friends. Some swear the coin writhed. Some say it only cooled. Some say the candle nearest to it developed a memory of winter and would not burn right again until spring." Jack, for his part, slid it, not into his own pocket, which would have been too intimate, but into the barman's tip cup, where mortal coins clinked around it, as if visiting a famous cousin. "Let it buy the house around," he said brightly, "when it learns to be what it is." Laughter returned, a little shaky, then stronger. Cups were lifted. The fiddler found the string again and made it sigh, then dance. Only the gentleman remained still, his gaze steady, his patience old. "You have me," he admitted, and the honesty in his tone brushed Jack like a cold feather. "For a night, for a bell's length, for the time it takes an ember to forget its fire. But then, Jack, then you will owe me a moment in return." Debt is a small word, but it wears long distances in its shoes. Jack knew it. What he did not yet know was how far his own feet would have to walk. He tipped his head, turned the matter with a grin, and begged another joke from the musicians, as if merriment might purchase time. "If you are listening now, and the room around you is dark and kind, tell me quietly where you are, and what time the clock keeps in your corner of the world. Across many nights we gather like lanterns on one long road. If this old tale is keeping you company, consider curling closer to the pillow, and, if you wish to find your way back here, subscribe to the entire history so our small fire can be waiting whenever you return." The barman slept well that night with the tip cup heavy as a promise. The villagers went home with talk in their pockets. The fog, pleased with the evening's mischief, trailed its skirts along the hedge and set the dew humming. And Jack? He leaned against the signpost at the crossroads when the inn had quieted, his palm warm from what he had trapped, listening to the night count its breaths and wondering, for a man must wonder, if he is wise, what shape his own promise would take. When the iron cooled and the door he had not yet seen began, somewhere beyond the hedge, to open. Dawn did not so much arrive as remember the village, laying a thin silver along the hedges and stroking the puddles until they gave back small versions of the sky. Crows walked the low stone walls like undertakers rehearsing their dignity, and the chapel bell tested its throat with the one soft note that went nowhere in particular. Jack had not slept. He drifted from the tavern to the lane and back, warming his hands on his own breath, the little iron cross a weight in his pocket that felt heavier, somehow, than iron should. When he touched it, he thought of the stranger's eyes. How they had not pleaded when trapped, only measured. There is a kind of patience older than storms, older than bargains carved in candle smoke. It waits without moving, and is never late. Jack, who gathered coins like a magpie gathers bright waste, knew he had caught something that would not rust. The barman opened late and cautious, as if the door had learned a new language overnight and might greet him in it. He poured Jack tea, because tea costs less than forgiveness, and set down the tip cup with both hands. The glittering coin lay among its dull cousins like a flake of daylight. When Jack lifted it between finger and thumb, the tavern seemed to tilt. Only a thread, only enough to make his heart notice. He smiled anyway. "You've been an obedient marvel," he told it, as one might praise a hound with too much wolf in its blood. But obedience ends. The iron cross, stitched, hidden, then suddenly sovereign, kissed his palm with cold. He walked out to the green. He walked as men walk, when they've promised themselves not to look over their shoulder, and the world keeps whispering that it would be wise to look anyway. The fog had thinned into a greying breath that lay low in the meadows. In it, the milestones looked like tired teeth. He reached the crossroads and waited. He did not speak. He did not need to. Promises call to their echo. The silence that loved that place arrived with the faintest smell of apples charred on a hearth and a sound like a horse turning in its sleep. "Morning," Jack said, as if greeting an old neighbour he didn't trust but could not help liking. The coin, which had seemed a coin, unlearned itself with a sigh too small for any ear but his. The gentleman's outline gathered from the air as dew gathers along a fence wire in beads that catch light and refuse to drop. He did not look offended. He looked inevitable. "A night," he said, recalling his own terms, "is long if you fear it, and short if you sing. You sang, Jack. You also owe me a moment. Jack rolled the iron cross in his palm until it almost warmed. A moment can be many things, he answered mildly. A breath, a laugh, a prayer, a step. I prefer steps that turn into paths, less costly than prayers, and more honest than laughs. The gentleman's smile was smaller by a hair's breadth, which for that face was the difference between company and judgment. You are a man, he said, who would bargain with weather if you thought it might buy you another dry hour. Jack bowed his head to the truth of it. He had traded flattery for favours, face for forgiveness, time for the right to waste it. Yet there, in the thin clarity of morning, he felt the ember in his chest flicker, not with triumph, but with a question. What did it profit him to outwit what could not be tired? He could not say. He only said, "Walk with me, I've work." They walked toward the orchards beyond the last cottage, where the dew made each spider's web a small wheel of frost, and the trees held October in their hands, seed black and sweet. Jack had told a widow he'd shake her apples for a fair price, and intended to shake them for a little more than fair. The gentleman carried no ladder and no sack, only the air of a man who arrives where lessons are likely. On the way, the village revealed itself as villages do at the hour when bread is rising and children argue quietly with boots, a dog counting sparrows as if tallying debts, an old man explaining to his cabbage rows that patience is a virtue, a girl turning her mother's shawl around her shoulders like a story. None paid much mind to Jack, which suited him. None saw the shadow that failed to touch the ground exactly where his companion walked, which also suited him. At the orchard edge, Jack leaned his back to the oldest apple tree, the one that had stood through 3 landlords and more winters than anyone now living, and he looked up into its dark gold tangle. "Would you mind," he asked lazily, "climbing and dropping the fattest apples into my sack? I'll go halves." "Halves," the gentleman repeated, enjoying the word. He placed one boot on the lowest fork, as if the tree had invited him. He rose the way smoke rises, with authority and a hint of leisure. Apples thumped the earth, rolled to the skirts of grass, shone like held suns. Jack opened the sack, nodded, praised. When the branches bent and the air grew cider-sweet, he stepped forward, palmed the iron cross he had once kept as a charm, and now used as a verb, and pressed it deep into the bark. Cross to wood. Wood to promise. The tree accepted the mark as calmly as a parish accepts a bell. The change was not loud. It rarely is. The gentleman, hand poised to pluck another fruit, found that his hand had become a guest that would not be invited any further. He was part of the tree until the cross learned forgetfulness, and the cross, like many pious things, had long memory. He did not rage. He laughed once, the way a man laughs at a riddle he could have solved if he had cared to be uncomfortable sooner. Twice, he said, with iron, "You were consistent." Consistency is a virtue also claimed by stubbornness. Jack touched the bark and felt through it the old heart of the orchard beating slow. "It's Sunday," he lied, though it wasn't, "and the church will want you down before the bell." "It is Tuesday," the gentleman replied, amused, "and bells ring for many things. Birth, marriage, harvest, even warning." He looked down at Jack with no malice at all, which was more frightening than fury. "Finish your shaking, then tell me what you pay for this reprieve." Jack shook. He shook until the sack's throat was a mouthful of light. He found himself thinking of beds and the kindness of them, of tables, and the fairness they sometimes teach a man who eats at them alone, of the widow's face when he counted the coins and chose, for once, not to pinch. "If you are still with me, and the night around you is steady and low. Whisper where you're listening from, and what time your lamp keeps. Across quiet distances, we keep each other company. And if you'd like our road to find you again, gentle, patient, consider subscribing to the entire history, so the small embers of these tales will be warm when you return. By noon, the sack was full. The widow paid, and Jack's pockets heavier by less than he had intended, but more than he deserved. He returned to the tree with a bottle of the cider pressed last year, when the apples had seemed endless. He poured a cup and set it at the roots. "For courtesy," he said. The gentleman nodded once. "For courtesy," he agreed, and the iron cross in the bark kept its thoughtful grip while a wind rose from the sea and brought with it the taste of journeys not yet taken. Somewhere beyond the hawthorn hedge, a road dreamed of evening, and the first faint memory of a lantern stirred, like a seed beginning to wake in the dark. Afternoon drifted over the fields in slow, buttery layers, and the hedges took a deeper green, as if they had been sipping from the same jug of light. Gulls inland, on a stray wind, circled the stubble like folded letters with no address, and somewhere a sheep bell counted time more honestly than any clock. Jack sat beneath the old apple tree with his back to the bark, the iron cross tucked like a firm handhold where his palm had pressed it, and the gentleman still poised in those higher branches as comfortably as a cat pretending to be sculpture. This was not a trap with teeth, Jack told himself, only a pause with lessons. He had brought a loaf and shared it with the roots, crumbs for the little lives that worked the dark, and poured a second cup of last year's cider for Courtesy's older brother. Patience. The gentleman watched without grievance, his eyes the colour of coal before it is convinced to flame. "You are generous when you can afford it," he said, not unkindly. Jack rubbed a crumb to dust between his fingers. "And you are frank when you could be frightening," he murmured back. The orchard answered for them both. A leaf sipped at air. A branch gave a tired creak, like a bed that remembers laughter. "We've made a habit of iron today," the gentleman went on. "Shall we try a habit of terms?" Jack's ember, not pride, not conscience, something stubborn and small that had learned to glow on little, shifted in his chest. He thought of all the narrow places where he had pinched coin and comfort alike, the faces he had left measuring what they'd lost, the nights he had kept, all the warmth to himself. A man might spend a life outwitting debts, only to discover he had married one in secret. Terms, he agreed carefully, but not those that leave a man poorer than truth. A wind, like the memory of winter, brushed the orchard. "Free me down," the gentleman said softly, "and I will not take your soul when your last minute turns its face to me." The offer landed in the grass like a fallen apple, bright, suspiciously perfect. Jack rolled the words on his tongue. He thought of the church roof, how the crows claimed it each evening and left it untroubled each dawn. He thought of the widow's relieved nod, and how coins sometimes sound different when they are honest. He thought, though he would not have admitted it aloud, of the night beyond all taverns. "Not take," he repeated, "not own, not claim by any side door, nor by any name it goes by in places where the calendar has different saints." The gentleman's smile tilted. "You bargain like a man who has read the small print on the back of rain," he said. "Yes, not take, not own, not claim, on my honour, such as it is, if honour can be measured by constancy." The iron cross felt heavier in the bark, as if it too listened. "And no mischief tonight to balance the ledger?" Jack asked, because instinct is a mule and will bray when it smells a hill. "No mischief," came the reply, "beyond what men invent for themselves." It sounded fair, in the way thunderheads look fair from a distance. Jack let the silence taste the words. Somewhere a bee discovered there was nothing left to do, and went home. Then down you come, he said at last, and with 2 fingers he pried the little cross free, carefully, respectfully, as if persuading a nail from an old coffin, so the tree would not remember pain. The change was a simple thing. Gravity recovered its manners, branches forgot their guest, and the gentleman stepped to earth without sound, like a thought returning from a long distraction. He took the cup Jack had left on the roots, not because he needed it, but because politeness is a bridge even over deep water, and held it in a way that made the cider look older than last autumn and sweeter than this one. You measure your steps, he said, and count your breaths. One day you will discover that even careful men arrive where roads have been waiting. Jack met the cold dark eyes and did not blink. And one day, he answered, even roads will admit they were built because feet dared them to exist. There was no quarrel in it, only a recognition. They stood a while as the light unbuttoned itself down the hedge and slipped into the ditches, where frogs rehearsed their evening. The gentleman glanced up through the branches toward a sky already thinking of stars. There is more road for you, he mused, and more gate for me. When you tire of bargains, remember what we signed with wind today. With that, he tipped an invisible hat to the tree, to the cider, to the cross, now back in Jack's pocket like a cooled word, and he went, where? Into the orchard's shade, into the gap between 2 heartbeats, into that courteous corner of the world where the air forgets to be seen. Jack exhaled slowly. The ember in him steadied. He turned for home with the cross in his pocket, and the sense, new, unsettling, that it was not victory he had pocketed, but time. On the lane, the village thickened again out of afternoon. A boy ran with a hoop that clicked like a small clock. A woman salted her doorstep in a gesture older than the cottage. A smith hung a sprig of rowan by the lintel and pretended he had only done it for the colour. And Jack, who had for so long admired cleverness more than kindness, paused at each threshold as if thresholds themselves were speaking. Brighter in there if shared, they murmured, quieter if not alone. If you are listening now, warm in your own small circle of night, tell me softly where your pillow rests and what time your room keeps. Across the miles, we are a quiet village of lamplight. If these footsteps feel companionable and you'd like them to find you again, subscribe to the entire history, so the path remembers you and the stories wait with a gentle glow whenever you return. He slept early, which for Jack meant before the last song had finished at the inn, the bed took him in like a shore taking in a tired tide. He dreamed, not of coins, not of accounts, but of a dark lane curving toward a hill where a hollowed root held a coal that would not go out, and of doors that opened when breath became mist. And as the village settled into its chimneyed hush, October leaned with her back against the night and began, almost absent-mindedly, to shape from wind and harvest a small round thought with a handle, something to house a spark, something that might be carried when the road forgets its edges and the fog asks for a name. The days that followed folded neatly like clean linens, ordinary in the way a calm sea is ordinary until one remembers how deep it is. Jack rose early, mended a gate that had long needed the courtesy, returned a borrowed spade without being asked, and, to his own surprise, found that the faces of neighbours, faces he had once read like shop signs for opportunity, looked softer when he did not study them for profit. The ember in his chest did not grow exactly. It learned to breathe. the way a coal learns to become a quiet part of a larger fire. He kept the little iron cross respectful now, as one is with an old tool that has seen work, and he tucked the widow's thanks into the private shelf of his mind, where once he had kept tally of favours owed him. Yet time, even when politely spent, has a habit of circling back to what was promised, and on the last evening of October the lanes grew purposeful. Fog unrolled like parchment, with a message no one had written and everyone could read. Hedges gathered the hush and tied it with twine. The chapel bell did not ring, but somehow was heard. From fences came the smell of apples baked and carved, of peat and damp wool, and from doorsteps the small arrangements of salt, iron nails, and an extra bowl set quietly by the hearth, just in case those who had walked ahead wished to rest. Jack paused at each sight, smiling the smile a man wears when he is beginning to understand that customs are not superstitions but letters addressed to time itself. The crossroads waited for him the way an old friend waits, without calling his name, certain he would come. He came. The signpost had shed a little bark, as if undressing for the night. A hare drew a quick sentence in the dew, and erased it with the next bound. Somewhere a cow answered a distant cow, and made of the valley a cup that held two notes. Jack stood with his hat in his hands because the air had that feeling, church but without the walls. "Evening," he said, and at once the gentleman was simply there, as inevitable as the next breath after a held one. He wore no shadow strong enough to frighten, only a grace, old as rivers, where men have watched their faces and told the truth to no one. "Your moment," the stranger reminded, as if finishing a conversation neither of them had needed to begin. Jack felt no panic. He had earned a kind of courtesy from fear by paying it little and paying it early. "Tell me the size of it," he said. "A breath? A turn of a leaf? The time it takes a coal to confess it is a flame?" The gentleman's smile found its hinge. "A refusal," he said softly, and that word opened like a door that has been waiting for the right hand. "Before midnight, someone will offer you ease for nothing, warmth for free, a place by a fire you do not deserve. Refuse it, that is all." The request was small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. Small things are the ones that change a man. Jack thought of his old habits, how refusal had been his favourite coin, and felt unease twist like wind through rushes. "If I say no," he murmured, "to what was meant kindly, will I not become the man I've been trying to leave?" The gentleman studied him with a patience that had the weight of centuries and the lightness of smoke. "Debts teach shape," he replied. "Yours has always preferred the narrow." He did not threaten. He did not need to. They walked, because walking turns thoughts into companions, past the last cottages where turnips had been scooped to thin shells and lit from within. Little moons wearing human faces, a low laughter of children following the bobbing glow. Doors stood half opened, as if the village itself were listening for footsteps it loved. Names of the dead were said not loudly, not sadly, but the way one lays a blanket on a chair to save the seat. An old man waved Jack in from a threshold that smelled of butter and smoke. "Come take the stool by the oven," he called. "Plenty of heat, plenty of bread." The gentleman's eyes did not move. Jack's throat did. "Thank you," he said, and he lifted a hand that meant greeting and apology at once. "But I've promised to keep the lane tonight." They went on, and the refusal was not hard. He had said no to better for less reason. But the next door belonged to the barman, whose wife had taken to setting 3 cups now, one for her, one for the man who never made money come home, and one for the one who had started trying. "Sit," she urged, "while the stew finds its voice." Jack's mouth filled with the herb-scented dark of it. The gentleman's stillness grew companionable as rain on thatch. Jack closed his eyes and said quietly, "Another night." They moved on, and refusal began to cost. Lamps made hospitable halos on the road's skin. Children with posies of rowan and salt asked him, with the grave delight of the very young, if he needed company to fend off any wandering mischiefs. He wanted to say yes, not because he feared mischief, but because the small warm hands worked on the iron cross in his pocket like a benediction. "Guard your own lintels," he said with a bow. "I am well enough." Midnight approached with the slow assurance of a tide. At the last house, where a widow who had not remarried kept her chimney speaking to the stars, someone had set one more place, and at it a hollowed turnip shone like a modest lantern, with a patient smile. The chair behind it was empty. The gentleman stopped without ceremony. "This is the one," he said, and was suddenly less a stranger and more like an older version of the road itself. Jack stood there for a long time while the stew spoke in its sleep and the turnip lantern breathed. Kindness does not argue, it waits. When at last he knocked and the widow called that of course he must come in, he took the handle, then let it go, and said with a voice that had to pass through old stone to be heard, "Another night," and turned back to the fog. Something lifted from his chest, not pride, not victory, a filament of thread, perhaps, that had once tied him to the man who always kept the chair for himself. The gentleman nodded as if a tutor had watched a stubborn pupil write a clean letter. "Debt paid," he murmured. "Not ended?" He put into Jack's palm a coal that did not belong to any hearth, the colour of distance, the temperature of memory. "Carry this," he said, "when roads fail you." It did not burn his hand. It burned his certainty. If you're listening in your own circle of quiet, tell me softly where you are and what time the night wears on your side of the world. These little lanterns we share find each other by such small signals. And if you'd like to keep walking with us, slow steps, old roads, gentle turns, subscribe to the entire history, so our fire will be there whenever you return. Jack left the village lights behind, the coal warm in his palm, and the turnip's small face shining after him like a blessing. Somewhere ahead, where the hedges forget their edges, a shape with a handle waited to be born from the dark. He walked out past the last hedge, where the lane forgot to be a lane and became only a rumour in the grass, the coal in his palm a small heartbeat that did not belong to flesh. It pulsed like a memory of fires he had warmed himself beside and not paid for, of kitchens where he had eaten more than he had brought, of faces that had turned him out gently when gentleness was all they could afford. He could have tucked it into his pocket, but some nameless courtesy told him to carry it where the night could see. The heat was not heat, not the kind that scorches or soothes, but a knowing that crept up the arm and into the chest and settled beside the ember he had always kept, as if the two had finally recognized one another after walking separate roads, fields spread to either side, October's breath making the grass bow like congregants murmuring the same simple prayer. And beyond, the bog wore its black patience with a kind of dignity only water can keep. Jack did not hurry. Those who hurry through thresholds seldom know what they owed the rooms they've left. He kept to the cart ruts as if they were lines in a letter whose author was determined not to be misunderstood. Somewhere ahead, the gentleman's presence faded into the general kindness of the dark. Not gone, no, not that, but diffused, like salt you can't see anymore and yet taste in everything. The coal lit only as far as the next careful step and the next. But he discovered that distance can be made of many small certainties stitched together, and that this sewing is a kind of bravery he had not practiced when he was busy counting coins. A milky mist rose, the world loosened its edges. The chapel bell did not ring, yet something in him answered anyway, the way one answers a name that is not one's own, but might have been if life had bent another inch. He found a stile and climbed it, boots whispering against the old wood. He found a stone wall and followed it, with his fingers as if the mason who'd built it had left instructions in the lichen. The bog greeted him with that low, old smell of earth teaching water why to wait. Lights pricked the distance where other villages curled like cats for the night. An owl stitched the air from one field to the next, and signed its work with a single thread of sound. If a road could remember, this one remembered every step he had ever taken to the tavern and back, every sly detour that had brought him to a fuller purse and an emptier evening, and it considered him now with the impartiality of old oak. At the lip of the bog, where rushes kept their lances level and frogs practised their psalms, Jack paused because the land itself seemed to be asking him a question. He had spent a long season becoming clever. Now the night wanted to know if he might become simple. He crouched, leaned the coal toward the ground, and watched its patient dark orange breathe. It did not flare. It did not beg for kindling. It simply offered itself as a centre, small, stubborn, steady. And Jack, who had always pocketed centres until they went out, understood that he must build around this one a home that could be carried, a shelter that would not own the fire but accompany it. He searched along the hedge bank for what the night had been thinking of since the day began to close, a turnip left by someone who had carved too many or too few, its inside already hallowed by hunger, and its rind marked by the faint calligraphy of weather. He found instead a rude knot of root, a bulbous thing, stubborn and ugly, all scar and awkward curve, half pulled from the dirt by a fox's optimism, and left like a story that had embarrassed its own teller. Jack smiled, the new way he had learned, which was not to claim the finding as cleverness, but to accept it as a kindness. With his knife, he teased away the packed soil, the fine hairs, the bitterness. Patient work is a language, and he was just beginning to speak it. He scooped a hollow, breathing soft, so the steam of the earth would not sting his eyes, and he set the coal within. For a moment nothing changed. Then the root began to confess a glow it had not known it could hold. The rough skin, pitted and plain, learned to be a window. The bumps became geography for light to travel. A handle presented itself as if the plant had planned secretly to be carried all along. The bog nodded, the faintest ripple, the small approval of old water, and the fog stepped back a pace to see better. Jack rose, lantern in hand, though he did not yet know the word for it. It was simply a way to keep a promise warm. He walked. The light made a modest bowl around his feet, where grass blades turned to tiny spears of honeyed glass, where stones practiced shadows, where spiders' lines drew gold in mid-air. In that bowl walked all his refusals and all his nearly beginnings, and he found them less frightening than when they had been scattered across years and rooms and unpaid bills. The road grew curious, then kinder, offering him firmness where it could, and warning where it could not. Once, when he nearly strayed toward a patch whose green pretended to be safe, a snipe rose straight up, its cry a neat exclamation that turned his toes. He laughed under his breath and thanked it, and the laugh, meeting the light, became less like chaff and more like bread. He did not notice at first that the sky above him had changed, that the stars had gathered themselves into a sort of listening, that the moon, thin and sharp as a paring knife, had taken to walking at his shoulder like a patient dog. When he did, he felt no grandness, only company. He had been alone often. This was not that. Between one field and the next, the fog lifted its hem, and he found the little rise, where once an ash tree had stood before a winter broke it. The stump, silvered and soft as old bone, made a low table for the new-made light. Jack set his lantern there and sat on his heels, hands open on his knees, the way a man sits when he does not want to frighten a shy thing. He remembered the gentleman's face, as smoke remembered fire, not clearly, not always kindly, but with the respect one must offer to what has kept its shape too long to be scolded out of it. "Neither theirs nor yours," he murmured to the dark, meaning not heaven, not hell, not any square on the tidy checkerboard of the tales he had mocked and secretly feared. He did not quite know where he belonged. The coal answered by doing the one thing it could do perfectly. It continued. That was enough. Far off, a dog barked twice and retreated into sleep. Nearer, something small with quick paws revised its opinion of him and went about its business. Jack lifted the root lantern and felt, for the first time since he had learned to count, that counting might no longer be the best way to know a life. He thought of the widow's empty chair and how he had left it empty because a promise had asked it of him, and of how that emptiness had not been cold at all, but a warmth saved for later. He thought of the iron cross in his pocket, quieter now than he had ever known it. Not a tool, not a trick, just a shape that held a memory of good use. He stood, and the lantern made a small sunrise on his boots. Somewhere ahead, the road lost itself in peat and reed, and somewhere beyond that, in towns he had not yet cheated or forgiven, other doors would creak and other bells would say other names. He felt neither invited nor dismissed, only accompanied. And as he stepped down from the stump and let the light go first, the fog parted with the old manners of a curtain in a careful theatre, revealing, if reveal is the word for something the heart already guessed, a second gentler brightness in the distance, as if another hand, years or oceans away, had taken another route, and made for it too, a room for a spark. Toward the hour when cattle shift in their sleep and kitchen embers dream of morning, he followed the route lantern along the bog's quieter edges, learning the road the way a fingertip learns a seam, by patience, by trust, by letting small certainties accumulate until they felt like guidance. The coal breathed its steady orange in the hollow he had carved, and it seemed to him that the light did not so much push back the dark as befriend it, making of shadow a companion instead of a threat. He discovered, step by unhurried step, that there were other travellers out at that hour who did not startle at his approach, who wore the night as easily as a shawl. At first, he thought them the usual figures, the poacher with a grin clipped short as a hedgerow, the milkmaid with her mind on the calf that had taken sick, the old man who walked because old legs remember walking better than rest. But when they turned their faces toward him, he found in their eyes the calm of people who had finished with clocks. They did not speak. They gave him small nods, as one would give a neighbour, and the nod said, "Keep the flame." It seemed to Jack that their footsteps made no purchase on the dew. It seemed to him, too, that his own boots left prints deeper than they had any right to, as if the ground insisted he belonged to it a while longer. He took no pride in this. He let the sense of being briefly necessary pass through him like a warm draught in a cool house. In a dip of the land, where a ford braided itself from stones too polite to joke about slipperiness, he paused, and the lantern's glow laid honey along the shallow current. Midges wrote polite letters in the air, A reed bent to reed and rose again, satisfied. Across the stream the path widened as if it remembered markets and music, and beyond it a low hill held the hawthorn hedge that had been a rumour in his thoughts since the cider cup at the tree. As he mounted the far bank, he felt the presence he had come to think of as a weather-made person, part winter's patience, part summer's smoke, return without footfall. The gentleman, if name he must have, did not stand at his shoulder so much as lean his meaning against Jack's own. Some roads belong to no parish, that quiet suggested without words. They are kept not by fences, but by promises. Jack's hand tightened on the root handle, grateful for the weight that said here, as certainly as any boundary stone might. He thought of all the times he had made brightness at other people's expense, and how this small light cost him only attention and a willingness to carry. On the hill's shoulder he found a gate that had lost its latch long ago, and learned to behave like a gap rather than a decision. He set the lantern on the top bar and mended what he could with a length of twine from his pocket. The habit pleased him, an honest miserliness, keeping the night from spending itself foolishly on broken things. When he lifted the lantern again, something changed in the way the dark arranged itself. It was not fear, it was ceremony. The hedge parted where no hand had touched it and revealed, what else could it be? A little green hollow where names are kept, a place that villagers build out of silence and flowers and the memory of hands. Stones stood at their ease, not bragging, not shy. Moss guarded them with the discretion of servants who outlive the houses. Here and there a scallop shell had been set into the soil for a pilgrim not returned. Here and there a small toy, weather softened, held its post beside a newer name. Jack's feet learned quiet. He did not go among the markers. He walked the margin the way a man walks the edge of a lake that might, if distressed, forget it is not the sea. The light found the names and did not own them. It warmed the letters' edges and then moved on. He felt watched, yes, but not weighed. When the wind came, gentle, and from the sea's direction, it brought with it a sense of being counted in, not counted out. He thought then, not for the first time, of where he would lie when time folded at last and refused to be bargained with. He thought of the stranger's promise by the apple tree and wondered what sort of gate would meet him, wooden, iron, or made of an air so thin that only intention passes. His soul did not rattle in him like loose cutlery. It sat in its chair and listened. Down from the hollow he went into a lane bordered by gorse that had already put away its gold for the year. A fox trotted ahead, looked back once with a knowing that bordered on amusement, and vanished as if the night had made a small joke to itself. Behind a low wall, a cottage lamp burned faint, as a thought one means to remember upon waking. Jack, without thinking, lifted his lantern a shade higher, and the two lights acknowledged each other the way neighbouring windows do in a storm. The coal made that gentle ticking sound a good fire sometimes makes, a sound like patience, counting softly. He began to hum, nothing he'd learned at the tavern, something older, and in the hum he found that the weariness which usually came as accusation now came as permission. He could be tired, he could go on, he could be both. When at last the lane lost interest in being straight and sidled toward the ruins of an old watchtower, he climbed its shoulder and let the lantern rest on the sill where archers had once squinted out across quarrels no one alive could now name. The view was unremarkable, which is to say it belonged to everyone. Fields believing in morning, hedges believing in their birds, a thin thread of smoke where some early riser had admitted defeat and coaxed the stove. He set the root lantern so that the opening faced the country, and for a long time he simply let the light breathe on the idea of distance. He remembered the barman's wife's extra cup, the widow's empty chair, the way refusals had gentled him by making room he did not yet know how to fill. Perhaps he thought there are journeys that do not begin at the leaving of a place, but at the moment one agrees to carry something that belongs to more than oneself. The gentleman's nearness dwindled to a courtesy, like the echo you stop hearing once you trust that the room will hold its shape. Jack wrapped the twine's end back around his fingers, slipped the iron cross to a quieter corner of his pocket, as one does with a tool between jobs, and took up the lantern again. He stepped down from the watchtower into a night that had thinned toward frost, and felt, as surely as he had ever felt the weight of a coin, that somewhere beyond the bog and the orchards and the quiet parish line lay another road, with another hedge and another pair of hands, somewhere across water perhaps, already hollowing around a fruit, already making, from a different harvest, a room for a wandering spark. By the time the bog's patience loosened into fields again, and the watchtower's old window remembered how to frame a horizon, the root lantern had learned its work the way a hand learns a friend's hand, without hurry, with a trust that deepens, rather than dazzles. It did not flare or boast, it only offered, and in its offering the night found itself calmer, like a room that knows who has come home. Jack moved along the lane and felt, with each step, how the coal's steady orange made a small round room he could carry, walls of gentleness and a roof of listening, inside which his thoughts stood up straighter and spoke more softly. He had always believed hollow meant lacking, a word for a pocket turned inside out. But as the lantern rode his palm, he discovered that a hollow could be a kindness, a shaped welcome, a place made on purpose for a guest you cannot own. The root had surrendered bitterness to become shelter. The coal had surrendered pride to become company. He wondered, not unshyly, whether a man might do the same. The village had not slept as fully as he had thought. At one doorway an old woman sat with her knitting like a spell that mended more than wool. She lifted her eyes to the lantern and nodded, as if finally recognizing a song she had hummed for years. At another, a child, hair a tangle of thistledown, blanket a cape against an October, peered around her mother's skirt, and smiled with such grave delight that Jack, without meaning to, tilted the opening so its low gold could kiss the threshold. "For your dead," he said, not sure whether he meant the ones the family named aloud, or the quieter losses no one had yet learned to speak of. The mother mouthed thanks. The child waved once, the way very young kings might wave to seas they don't yet know they will one day cross. At the green, the signpost wore a thin rim of rime, as if it had tried on a circlet and found it too proud. Jack set the lantern at its foot, and for a breath the crossroads resembled a four-walled chapel made of roads, each aisle leading to work, to worship, to mischief, to mending. He touched the iron cross in his pocket, not to summon, not to boast, just to remember that promises have shapes. And then he took the lantern up and made for the chapel, because bells do not always ring with metal. The door stood open to the night's shoulder. Inside, candles leaned toward one another as families do when weather has opinions. No priest kept watch. This was not an hour for officers, but the room held a carefulness that made shoes quieter on flagstone. Names rested in the air like feathers that had decided not to fall. Jack did not go far. He stayed where draughts think. He set the lantern on the first cool step and let its breath converse with the candle's finer flames. Light recognized light. They did not compete. In their meeting, the shadows rearranged themselves kindly, making room on pews for memories to sit without jostling. He thought of refusals, how they had once been his weapons, and how, lately, one had been a gift. He thought of acceptances, how one might open a hollow in the self and keep it clean for the right guest. He did not pray, he listened. The gentleman's nearness visited the doorway like a winter he no longer feared. It did not enter. It approved. Hollow, that quiet seemed to say, is a shape the world trusts. Keep it honest. Jack nodded. When he lifted the lantern again, the chapel's candles did not seem dimmer. They seemed to have been given a cousin. Out in the yard, the yew trees kept their grave secrets and laughed among themselves in a voice like a bottle rolled gently on a tide. Jack passed through them with a care he had never bothered to learn in younger nights, and felt the oddest courage, one that did not require noise. The hedge beyond had been hung with small tokens, rowan loops, iron nails sewn in red string, a single silver button that had failed its waistcoat and found promotion as a charm. He added nothing. He had already added what he could, a light willing to be carried and to leave no scorch. And yet, as he turned toward the lane that would take him past the last house and into the wider dark, he felt not a hand, but a recognition at his back, like the town itself standing on its toes to see which road he took. The coal was warm as memory. The root's carved emptiness felt newly right in his palm. No grasping, no hoarding, only holding. He followed the ditch that gilded itself with frost, and thought timidly, almost boyishly, of others. In his mind's eye there were shores he had never named, and fields he had never pretended to have owned, and in those places someone else had taken a fruit more generous than any turnip, a round, ribbed thing, green when shy, orange when certain, and scooped it out to make a room for a wandering ember. He could not know the word they used. He only knew that the gesture rhymed with his. He walked until the bog's breath returned to test him, and the reeds sounded their thin harps. He walked until the old ash stump found again his boot's memory, and let him sit. The lantern went on the stump's low table, and the world arrived to be seen. Spiderwork jewelled with dew, like soft constellations fallen to earth. A moth the size of a thumb's nail tooling slow loops around the opening, reading light as if it were scripture. The far-off mutter of the sea, reminding the land that even borders have hearts. Jack leaned his elbows on his knees and felt the coal's patience teach his own. Once he had admired suddenness, the snap of a trick, the quick turn of advantage, and called it clever. Now he began to admire endurance, heat that does not brag, a glow that does not blister, care that does not shout its name. He could almost believe a life might be carved the same way a root is carved, with careful insistence, with waste set aside for the soil to eat, with the understanding that what is removed makes room for what must be kept. In the near dark, something shifted. Not the gentleman exactly. No cuff, no hinged smile, but a tilt in the night, like a head turning to listen. The lane behind him lost a little of its distance. The hedges in front breathed together, as if about to speak. He stood, lantern in hand, and the stump felt suddenly like a threshold rather than a seat. He sensed, not with fear, but with the formal curiosity of a man at the mouth of a story, that the year itself had drawn a breath and meant to exhale in an older language. A light wind gathered in the hawthorn and trimmed its voice to a whisper. Beyond the reeds a fox coughed, amused, as if announcing a guest who preferred to arrive without footprints. Jack lifted the root by its narrow handle, and the glow answered with a soft yes. He had learned the hollow, he had learned the holding. What remained was to learn the door. And there at the edge of the bog, where the ground remembered once being forest, the air thinned the way paper thins where it has been folded often, and something on the old side of things, the side with longer shadows and kinder rules, reached through to test the orange he carried. The thinning of the air at the bog's edge was not a rupture, but a courtesy, like a curtain drawn back by an invisible hand that knew how to keep fabric from catching on splinters. Jack felt it first along the skin of his forearms, a sift of cold so exact it seemed to be choosing him hair by hair, and then inside his breath, where a second breath, older and quieter, stepped alongside. The root lantern did not flare. It deepened, as if reminded that embers have cousins in other rooms, and the little orange pooled a fraction richer in its hollowed heart. He held it forward and found that space answered by remembering how to be a doorway. The reeds, which had been rehearsing their thin psalms, lowered their voices. The bog, which had been listening like a patient audience, moved one thoughtful inch closer. In that gentle seam between worlds, figures arrived without taking steps. They were not the theatrical dead of tavern talk, no rattling, no hunger with teeth. They were, as he had seen them in the green hollow, diminished to a kind of calm that forgives clocks, but here their calm stood up straighter, like a coat finding its proper hanger. They wore October the way children wear solemnity at their first chore, carefully, with a pleasure they pretend not to feel. They nodded, some with faces he knew only by resemblance to the living, some with faces that might have been his own if a century had leaned another way, and their nod said, "Carry the room you have made. We will meet you inside it." Jack made room by not filling the silence with the cleverness he had once spent like small change. He presented the lantern. One by one, the figures passed its light as people pass their hands over a fire to learn its truth, without asking it for more than warmth. None reached to take it. All seemed relieved to find it carried. A thin salt smell came with them, not sea salt, though the sea had opinions nearby, but the homely salt of doorsteps and careful rests, of bread baked as letter and eaten as reply. He recalled the thresholds he had seen dressed with rowan loops and iron nails, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that such charms are not contradictions of love, but its manners, the living asking the dead to enter with the same gentleness they would expect from any guest. The gentleman's presence drew up beside him, not embodied, not absent, like a wind that has decided to be smelled rather than heard. If it had words, they were the kind not fit for a mouth. Keep steady, do not boast, your hollow is a promise. Jack steadied, did not boast, kept the promise, and found that the promise answered back by making him less alone. The night beyond the opening bore traces, a whisper of cattle shifting, a thin skein of yonder dog, the quilted sigh of a village turning in sleep. But inside the seam, a different geography held sway. He saw, as one sees through glass that is known weather, a lane that looked like his lane, if someone had drawn it with a softer pencil, a chapel without candles that still glowed, as if every name in it had decided to shine, an orchard whose oldest tree bore not fruit, but bells, and each bell rang inside the ear without troubling the air. These were not places to live in. They were the inside of things he had already known, the meanings stored like grain under their roofs. A child, grave as a magistrate, stood before him with a sprig of rowan. Her face was not the face of any family he could name, and at the same time it was the face villagers make when they agree to go on. She did not ask his name. She touched the lantern's rough rim with 2 fingers, as one touches a font on the way past. "Not yours," she said, and her voice was the kind that makes dogs lie down. "Not ours, ours and yours." He bowed to grammar raised above law. Others came, An old woman tying and untying a red thread, a man who smelled of peat and iron and carried his hat with more respect than men carry bishops, a seam of figures whose hands shone faintly from a lifetime of work the parish would forget to praise. He had no wisdom to pay them with. He had only the carriage of a small light and the humility to let it be enough. The gentleman's nearness tilted, satisfied. In the seam's middle, a memory tried to dress itself as a question, and Jack, who had learned lately not to answer questions too quickly, let it finish. Would he trade? It wondered. This easy belonging between worlds for some louder belonging to one. The old bargains, the coin that becomes a bishop's face if you tilt it right, the door that opens at the price of someone else's closed door. His hands found their answer before his mouth did. They kept the lantern balanced so its circle touched both grasses, and none so its warmth did not coerce. Neither, he said at last, not defiant, not meek, only reportorial. Both, if both will have me, or just this walking. A murmur of approval went through the figures, like wind through beach. In it, he could hear the chapel's yews laughing, the watchtower settling its old stones, the widow's empty chair consenting to be a saved place rather than a wound. He realised, with a tenderness that embarrassed him even alone, that the ember he had always hoarded was no longer lonely. It had been given a job. The seam thinned toward closing, as seams do when hands stop needing a pocket, and one shape lingered, a man whose face was not quite a face, more the notion of a face, with the sort of smile that knows fishes' hours and newborns' cries, and the exact point at which a coal ceases to be stubborn and becomes generous. He lifted a finger, not to command, to suggest, and pointed beyond the bog, beyond the orchard's shoulder, past the road that remembered every boot, toward the edge of the map, where water begins, telling the land what shape to be. Jack did not see ships. He saw the idea of ships. He did not see pumpkins. He saw the idea of roundness made hospitable. The finger drew a small circle in the air, no bigger than a quince, and then a larger one, no smaller than a barrel hoop, and Jack, who was not quick, but who had become willing, understood that the room he carried would one day be carried by others in rooms more generous than roots. The seam closed without drama. The reeds rehearsed their psalms again. The bog reassembled its patience pleased. He stood where he had been, the ash stump for a table, the fox somewhere amused, the moon with her paring knife smile doing her best to remember how to be kind to men who had not always deserved it, and he found that nothing had changed, and everything had. The lantern's orange was the same, his boots were still wet at the seams, but the road ahead was no longer only a walk toward morning. It was the first mile of a longer sentence in which distant hedges and unheard bells would rhyme with his own. He lifted the root by its handle, and in the low bowl of light a path offered itself, curving toward heather and bog, toward a whispering green where names travel softly, toward a hill whose other side he could not yet see. Word of the small carried room of light moved the way news always has in such places, on the backs of errands, in the hems of gossip, folded into the steam off a pot and the smoke that goes politely through thatch. No one said Jack's name loudly, and yet the lanes learned the shape of his footsteps, and hedges leaned a thought closer when his root lantern rounded a bend. At dusk, children became his echo. Hands cupped around turnips their fathers had hollowed with blunt knives and good patience, faces pricked with pinholes for smiles and starry eyes. Where a house was poor, a beet would do, or a jar with a stub of tallow and a lid of punch tin. Each a little promise that the night would be met with friendship rather than quarrel. He did not instruct them. Children have their own tutors, older than books. But when his circle of orange passed a gate, small circles bloomed behind it until the green itself looked like a sky turned upside down, constellations low to the grass, breathing softly. Old women who had stopped calling the dead by name except on one careful night resumed the habit in whispers. Old men who had kept iron in their pockets for decades began to leave a sliver of bread on the sill as well, because bread says sit, where iron says mind yourself. The chapel candles were steadier for his visits, though he never touched their wicks. The watchtower, thinking itself mostly forgotten, found it liked the shy attention of a glow that asked for nothing but company. Even the smith, who was a practical man and disliked anything that made iron feel less than final, nodded in passing because a road lit well is good for a horse's shoe. Jack walked as if learning to be a seam himself, the joining of door to threshold, hedge to ditch, year to year. Sometimes, at the corner where gorse gives way to broom and the bog tastes the lane with its old dark tongue, he would feel a nearness like weather that had chosen him to lean on. He did not always look. When he did, he found the gentleman not in full, no hinge of smile, no fine boot catching a stingy moon, but as a correctness in the shadow, a suggestion that debts and mercies enjoy balance when a man stops trying to stand on the heavier side. Once at the widow's gate, the nearness showed itself as a scent, not peat, not apple, something between coal and rain, and Jack almost laughed at his own relief that even companions who have measured you without malice can return as simple approval. The children learned a game. They would hold their lanterns to the hedge and listen, and if the leaves rustled, they would declare that someone listening from before had nodded. If a moth circled twice, they would clap softly and say a name, not loudly and not twice, because names prefer to be carried like fragile glass. Mothers watched from doorways, needlework resting on their knees, the way a cat rests, ready to move, ready to stay. Fathers stood with arms folded, which in such cases means only that a man hopes to look steady while the old stories put a hand through the curtain and count his household kindly. Jack's circle of light remained small, never farther than a stone's honest throw, but his steps lengthened. He took to visiting the hedgerows that circled the fields closest to the sea, where the wind writes without pausing to spell, and the grass, salt-browned at the tips, leans like a congregation that can't help but sway. There he heard something new. Not voices, not bells, not the chapel's wood settling, but a kind of faraway imagining, as if a road across water were rehearsing its own best posture. He set the lantern on a rock the colour of old pewter, and listened until listening became a kind of prayer he could admit to himself. "Neither theirs nor yours," he said again, not to be clever, only because the words had learned to open a door without creaking. The lantern's orange agreed by continuing, in the lane by the orchard, the oldest tree shed its last few leaves with the lingering grace of a woman who knows the dance has ended but keeps time in her heel. Each leaf fell through Jack's light and became, for a blink, a lit coin changing hands without buying anything. He remembered then the coin that had not been a coin and felt a small, honest shame, the kind that doesn't scold, only tidies a shelf no one else sees. He touched the iron cross in his pocket, not as a ward, but as a remembrance of exactness, and the iron, obliged, offered nothing but its cool presence. On All Souls' morning, when the fog thinned into lace and the village smelled of ashes that had done their job, he took the lantern to the green and found the barman's wife setting 3 cups, as she always did, one of them at last filled for a man who had begun to deserve being counted. She looked at Jack, then at the light, Then at the boy their house had been missing since midsummer, whose absence sat in his chair like a careful ghost that doesn't wish to overstep. She said nothing. The lantern said nothing. Silence, used properly, can be as welcome as stew. Jack lowered the root until its glow kissed the lip of the empty cup, then lifted it again. The woman's chin trembled once, like a bell struck softly in a neighbour church. She went back inside with a steadier back. Out by the bog, the seam between worlds behaved itself, which is to say it remained where it was, available but not importunate. Those who needed it found it, and those who didn't left it in peace. The gentleman's nearness came once more clear as breath on cold glass. Keep walking, that courtesy suggested. One day you will come to an edge that calls itself a beginning. Jack tilted the lantern so the light pooled ahead of his boots, and thought, not unhappily, that edges and beginnings had always been fond of each other. In such a mood, a man can believe himself ready for change he cannot name. That night he followed the lane to where it meets the little rise above the shore, and stood while the tide made its patient arithmetic against the rocks. The lantern's circle quivered in the wind, but did not falter. He thought of roundness, of the root cupping fire, of the moon cuppering the tide, of a mouth saying a blessing, of doorways meant to be gone through. Behind him, the village doused its lights, one by gentle one, a practised constellation going to sleep. Ahead of him, far beyond the harbour's black spoon, something answered the night with a pulse not yet visible, only felt, the hint of another fruit in another soil, larger, softer, ready to be emptied, not out of hunger, but out of welcome. He held the root by its narrow handle and let the thought settle where the ember in his chest had learned to breathe. Then he turned for home, because journeys begin better when a man remembers where to wave from. Behind him the sea worked its sums, and in the hedges the fog wrote a quiet sentence whose last word he would only learn when the wind shifted and the year rolled its page. The shore learned him the way a book learns a careful reader, by yielding only as much as was asked, and keeping back the rest for later evenings. Jack stood above the tide on that little rise, where wind combs the gorse and the grass kneels without shame, and he let the root lantern rest in the crook of his arm while the sea unstitched and stitched its blue-black seam. The road of water spoke in patient sums, and somewhere in that adding and subtracting he felt the old presence draw near, not as boot or breath, but as a correctness in the air, the way frost makes even the untidiest field look briefly resolved. The gentleman did not appear at his elbow. He arrived as a change in the world's posture, and Jack, who had begun to know the manners of such company, turned a fraction and said nothing. "You walk well," that courtesy said without lips, approval folded like a letter too personal to read aloud. "You carry better than you did." Jack smiled the new small smile that kept no tally. "The road is kinder when I let it be what it is," he answered softly, and the wind treated the reply with respect, laying it down on the rocks like a coin that won't be spent today. For a time they shared the view, the way two men might share a bench without history, the harbour spooned with shadow, the far buoys committing their faint, faithful blinks, the stars rehearsing their quiet dictatorship above labour and sleep. Then, because old bargains like to keep their hand in, the nearness set a gentle test down between them, not like a trap, more like a chessboard laid for a game that has never hurt anyone except their pride. "A wager," it suggested, the word itself smiling like cut fruit. "No thunder, no smoke. If your light can be asked and not given, if it can be begged and not kept, if, in short, you can refuse where refusal would be cowardice, or coin sense by another name, then I will leave you to your lanes for a season without asking you to stiffen your back against me. But if you clutch the glow, as once you clutched your cleverness, I will have one night unchallenged to bend your steps toward roads you do not love. It was in the old style perfectly fair and perfectly perilous, because the thing asked for was not a feat, but a kindness in true measure. Jack felt the coal's small certainty in his palm, the way a child's hand can quiet a room without trying. He thought of the widow's empty chair, of the barman's third cup, of the children's jars with punched tin lids, making constellations at ankle height. He thought, too, of the man he had been, the leaner at doorways, the buyer of drinks with other men's pride, and how easily a new habit can be made to wear the face of the old if one admires it too closely. I accept, he said, because a man cannot walk forever without saying yes to something difficult, and the nearness tilted its approval. The trial did not wait. Trials seldom do when the night has other appointments. Down the slope came a figure with that careful walk that says pain has opinions. An old fisherman with salt in his beard and a cap that had known 3 owners, his lantern, a mere memory of tallow and habit, its wick sulking for want of courage. He lifted it toward Jack in a gesture more question than plea. Jack swung his root lantern open so that the orange could kiss the failing wick, and when it caught, he did not count the exchange as a gift given, but as a debt settled in the currency of warmth. The fisherman nodded once, in the slow grammar of men who have learned tides as children learn hymns, and turned for home with light that was now his to mind. Good, said the nearness, though it did not move its mouth to say so. The second approach was less simple, a trio of boys playing bravery with the night, 2 laughing too loudly to persuade themselves, the third quiet in that way which hints at grief with its boots still on. They had carved their turnip poorly, a maw of triangular teeth that made it more monster than friend. Its hollow had scorched and smouldered into sulk. Jack kneeled, set his root lantern nearby like an uncle who has taken off his hat, and taught the boys the small courtesies of fire. Air enough to breathe, walls thin enough to invite, a wick not arrogant. He relit their little world and didn't hover. Instead, he sent them onward with a look that said, duty can be a game if you let it. The nearness approved again, a shade more reserved, not because the deed was thin, but because tests enjoy escalation. It came as it was bound to, in a form that reached a hand into the cupboard where Jack had lately kept his bed of bread, a stranger from the coast road with a foreign set to his coat, sea-worn and hollow-eyed, carrying a child who slept the deep, hot sleep of fever and dreams. His lantern had drowned somewhere between one wave and the next, and what he carried now was nothing but darkness in a tin promise. Sir, he asked, voice all apology, we have walked too far without a left hand of light. I could take yours for an hour to the inn, and then bring it back, with thanks too poor to count. Here was the edge of the board where men lose pieces they love. Jack felt like an old itch, the urge to measure, to say, lend, then repay. My root for your coin. Yet in the same breath he saw the third cup on the barman's table, the way children hold lanterns up to hedges to hear their leaves agree, the way the widow's door had been a saved place, even empty. He unlooped the twine from his wrist, tied the root lantern's handle onto the tin hoop the stranger offered, and pressed the warm, round room into another's keeping. Bring back the hunger, he said gently, meaning the will to return. Leave the thanks. The stranger's eyes filled like a basin just before the clean spill. He went toward the inn, and Jack stood, hands light, pockets heavier by nothing at all. The nearness grew very quiet. It is a humbling thing for old powers to be pleased without reservation, and it did not rush to dress the feeling as instruction. Season, it said at last, promise written in dew. Go on, Jack. He moved along the cliff path, emptier and therefore larger, the way a room feels when furniture remembers it will be sat on again. By the time the stranger returned, child cooler, lantern clearly loved, the tide had lifted its arithmetic to a new column, and the wind had mended its coat. Jack accepted the route back not as property regained, but as a pilgrim welcomed, and the coal settled in its hollow with the sound all good fire makes when it trusts a house. After that, the wager lay down between them like a well-fed dog. No claws, no teeth, only a heartbeat that said done for now. They walked together, the visible man and the weather that chose him, past the last house and the first gate, up to the watchtower that liked his visits. The gentleman did not take form, but the stones remembered him and straightened a little, as servants do when a kinder master walks past the door. The world, that nearness said, more to the field than to Jack, is rounder than your parish. Jack looked out at the lines that water draws on maps, those insinuations of elsewhere, and he thought again of the circle the not-quite-faced man had drawn in the seam. Quince first, barrel hoop after. He imagined fruit rounder than roots, skins that bruise into lantern colour, hands across an ocean teaching knives the same patient language his had learned on the hedge bank. He did not know ship names, he did not know harvest rituals beyond hedges he could touch. He knew the rhyme. He let the watchtower hold the lantern for a while and watched the sea practice mercy on rock and rope. Somewhere in the dark, a gull laughed the way gulls do when they remember nights in which fishers make choices fishers later forgive themselves for. Jack smiled at that too, and when he took up the route again, it felt lighter, not because the coal had faded, but because the carrying had become less like ownership and more like promise kept. He stepped down from the stones, and in the lane beyond, where frost began to embroider the nettles with delicate warnings, he thought he saw, far off, no more than a suggestion, the answering blush of another lantern, one housed in a fruit he had not yet held, bobbing where roads turned to water and men turned to stories. The hills gathered themselves as evening climbed, laid shoulder to shoulder like old friends, drawing close against a thought of weather. And on their crowns the first bonfires put up their gentle throats aflame. No grand roar, only the steady syllables of wood speaking with heat, ash and oak, thorn and a little driftwood from the shore, each with a memory to release. The village below answered in mirrors. Hearths kindled deliberately, lamps cupped behind curtains, small turnip lanterns breathing on sills beside saucers of milk and a heel of bread, because kindness needs something to sit down with when it arrives late. Jack walked the boundaries as a tailor might walk a length of cloth, checking the selvage, admiring the weave. In his hand, the root lantern made its modest room of orange, a portable hush that taught the darker hush how to be companionable. Where the lane narrowed between gorse and hawthorn, he paused to listen. Where the lane opened past the last wall into meadow, he lifted the light and let its circle settle like a blessing on grass, already crisping with rime. He saw iron at thresholds, a nail in red thread, a horseshoe kept not for luck but for manners, and he saw, too, what iron cannot do. The way a whispered name warms the air, the way a chair turned toward the door admits a remembered step. The bonfires on the hills multiplied by patience, not by speed. Boys with arms full of kindling learned to move as if their cargo were a sleeping child. The elders set their backs carefully, the way men do when they know they'll be watched by grandsons, trying on bravery. From one height to the next, signals went unspoken but understood. Light here, light there, light held steady. The sea replied with its faint replicas, the small gleam on a combing wave, the wink of a buoy, confessing it has a job at night as well as by day. Between hill and shore, Jack's little glow walked like a note written in a margin where a teacher has left rooms for the pupil's own hand. At the chapel, candles leaned toward one another without consuming their neighbours. At the watchtower, the old embrasures remembered faces and forgave them. At the green, the signpost chose to be a kind of mast for a ship that would never move, and yet somehow remained at sea. Children in ragged masks, sacks with eyes, ribbons where cheeks should be, bobbed and bowed, reciting retorts inherited from grandmothers, blessings offered like riddles, riddles humbled into blessings. They ventured up the first slopes until mothers' voices, soft but skilled at finding their children's ankles in the dark, gathered them back. Jack directed no one. He kept the edge, the seam, the useful in-between. Once at the widow's gate, he found the extra place already warmed by the lantern she herself had carved, its face more patient than pretty. He tipped his own light toward it, and saw the two oranges agree without jealousy, a family resemblance newly recognized. From the orchard came sweeter notes, a pot of cider kept at a dignified simmer over a circle of stones, cups passing from palm to palm, with the older etiquette of sharing, no hoarding at the centre, no empty hands at the edge. The oldest apple tree stood black against the uprisen fires, and seemed, in that posture, a parishioner who knows all the verses and sings them quietly. Somewhere in the rise and fall of voices, the gentleman's nearness arrived like a correctness in the arrangement of sparks. He did not step from shadow. He did not need to. The air under Jack's hat brim cooled by a thread, as if a finger had drawn a thoughtful line there. Guard your thresholds, that weather seemed to say, not as command, but as compliment. Jack touched the iron cross in his pocket, not to wake it, only to remember its shape, and felt how different the metal seemed when not asked to bite. Less weapon, more word. He went on. At the far meadow, where frogs conducted their autumn orchestra with dignified restraint, he found a low place in the hedge where the world beyond likes to put its hand through on nights with thinner fabric. The seam was well behaved, courteous, as a learned guest. Figures gathered on the other side as they had by the bog, calm, unhungry, wearing October with tidiness, and each time the hilltop fires lifted a phrase of flame, the seam brightened gently, like parchment appreciating a careful pen. Names were exchanged here without being said. A mother felt her daughter's braid between her fingers, after 20 winters of letting it go. A fisherman found the weight of his brother's hand on the net without seeing the hand. A child traced the outline of a father's laugh in the way an ember breaks to smaller coals and keeps its spirit. None reached with greed. None clutched. They let the space be hollow enough to hold without keeping. Jack stood back and kept the light honest. No dazzling, no starving. Only enough to say here and here and here. Then, because bonfires do more than warm, they teach, he climbed one of the smaller knolls and set the root lantern down near the bigger blaze. The hill's fire spoke in bold bars. His answered in a low continuo. Between them a lesson revealed itself, the kind that does not scold, only shows. Great light for distance, small light for doors, great light to say together, small light to say, "Come in." He felt the wager of the shore content to sleep, for its season had been honoured. He felt, too, the road of water beyond the parish line, keeping its own bonfires flashes on dark swells where men imagine at once danger and welcome. He could almost see the other coast, not as a map sees, but as a lantern sees. An orchard of rounder fruit swelling toward a colour that means harvest, even to eyes that have never known it. Hands carving hospitable rooms, with knives that learned patience from mothers who learned it from their fog. He did not need to hurry that vision. The village had work first, carrying embers home in pots with lids like small planets, banking stoves, picking a coal with tongs to bless the bread oven's mouth, setting turnip lanterns on low walls to guide the feet of those whose names are newly fragile. He walked among these ordinaries like a man counting a litany, grateful for each small office. And then the fires, as all fires must, began to tell their last pages. They fell inward, redder, more articulate in the ash. Sparks lofted and died, not tragically, but like birds finding the branch they had always meant. Families drew in. Latches lifted and fell. The seam at the hedge closed with a courtesy bow. Jack held the root lantern a little higher for those on late errands. Midwives, a cowman with a worry, a girl bringing broth to an aunt who insisted she wasn't ill. He kept the circle honest until the green had only its frost and its signpost, until the chapel's last thin candle chose to remember its flame rather than argue with it, until the watchtower's window, for the first time in years, reflected back a face content to be one face among many. He turned toward home then, the lanes defaulting to dew, the gorse breathing its faint coconut ghost, the hedges saying their leaf prayers. And as he passed the first cottage, the glass clouded with the comfortable fog of sleep within, a draught lifted his hair like a gentle hand, and a sound no louder than a twig, remembering it had once been leaf, tapped just twice on a pane, a soft testing knock. It did not startle him. It belonged to the night, and to what the night carries when invited. He paused, letting the lantern rest at his knee, and watched the breath on the window thicken and thin, as if shaping itself into a letter, into the beginning of a name. The fog on the glass furred and thinned until the pane seemed to breathe, with the room behind it, and in that slow tide of mist, a letter appeared, not carved, not written with any tool he could name, only coaxed from vapour by a fingertip that remembered what it was to be warm. A crooked J, hesitant at first, as if shy to knock twice, then truer, gathering a tail and a small bar across its top like a cap tipped politely. Jack did not flinch at his own initial. Names are less frightening when they arrive as breath and not as thunder. He lifted the root lantern just enough that its low orange polished the window without forcing it, and the line of fog obeyed a second thought, laying a faint A after the J, the way a path lays a plank across a ditch. Inside the house slept. He could hear the slow arithmetic of it. One snore, a kettle forgetting to be fully quiet, a log turning softly upon itself. He did not wake them. Old customs ask that you keep a vigil with more listening than talk. Besides, this knocking belonged to no malice. It was the lightest of inventory, the night counting its friends. The hedges leaned in to listen. The gorse held its coconut ghost the way a child holds a secret. On another cottage, 2 panes over, a boy's handprint, left earlier because boys answer night with curiosity before they learn to call it fear, offered a ready field for writing, and there too the mist shaped a crooked letter that might have been meant for someone never christened and yet answered anyway. Jack moved slowly along the row, his lantern cupping calm over each sill as if to say, "Here is room, but only if you enter gently." At one threshold, a horseshoe hammered, with its open mouth up, caught the glow and made a thin crescent, a smile that remembered iron once being ore, and ore once being stone, and stone once being sea. At another, a pinch of salt glittered, like a private constellation on the step. He touched the rim of his light to it and watched the crystals acknowledge, tiny suns agreeing to be small. The soft tapping came again, thin as reed speech, at the window of the widow who kept an extra chair. This time, instead of letters, the fog drew an oval no bigger than a palm, a kind of lantern face without features, as if the night were borrowing the idea and trying it on. Jack, smiling more with the eyes than the mouth, tipped his root so the orange could settle at the pane's edge. The oval accepted the warmth, blurred, then steadied again, the way a thought becomes a custom when given patience. He remembered, as a man remembers a tune without knowing when he learned it, how people will say that sometimes a name turns up on a window on the last night of October, faint as a whisper under glass, and that the kind thing to do is to trace it with a finger so the visitor knows they have not been forgotten, and then to wipe it clean so no one is made to stay longer than kindness can feed. He did not write his own. He let the pain choose its alphabet, and when it had finished the work it meant, he breathed lightly once across the letters and watched them sigh into blankness, free to be written again if needed. The gentleman's nearness moved at his shoulder like a cloak, remembering the shape of its wearer. No hinge smile tonight, no testing offer, just that slight, cool correctness. A teacher satisfied to see a pupil use the rule to fix a small thing rather than to win a large argument. On the green, the signpost wore a ring of frost, as a town crier might wear a ribbon. Beyond it, the watchtower kept its square of darkness open like a listening ear. Jack crossed to it, because ears are to be used when names practice themselves on glass. He set the lantern on the sill and leaned out over the field. From the hills, the last bonfires whispered to ash. From the orchard came a breath of sweetness, as if apples remembered being carried 2 by 2 from baskets to table. In the hedge, a fox passed, tail high, pausing for a heartbeat to consider his steady light as a new kind of moon. The tapping came softer now, not at a pane, but at the skin of the night itself, the way rain taps when it changes its mind. He thought of stories told in rooms like these when wind lifted the thatch, how some said a stingy man wanders with a coal because both gates refused him, and others said a clever man bought himself time and learned to spend it better, and others insisted that neither stinginess nor cleverness matter as much as a small circle of warmth carried without greed. He did not pick among them. His business was neither verdict nor defence. It was the seam, the courteous between. He lifted the lantern again and walked slow, so as not to startle the doctrine of thresholds, back along the cottages. On one pane, the fog had nearly finished a name that started like his and ended like someone else's, and he traced the last uncertain letter with a knuckle, not to own it, but to complete its wanting. Inside that house, a child turned over in sleep and smiled, as children do when their names are set down neatly in the night ledger. On another, the glass remained undecided, and he let it, because not every belonging needs to be told aloud. A wind came up from the sea, learned the lanes with quick fingers, and then meeting his small orange, softened into a draught fit for a cradle. He walked into it until the lanes thinned toward the bog again, where reeds wrote their patient psalms, and the ash stump remembered his boots. He set the lantern on that old table and listened. 1,000 little hushes laid upon one another until they were a quilt. In that quilt, he could hear the parish breathing, and under that something else, a second breath, older than the parish, older than the hedges, content to share the room now that the room had been made honest. He thought of letters becoming names, and names becoming invitations, and invitations becoming doors. He thought, too, of the circle he had seen drawn in the seam, quince small and barrel hoop broad, and felt again the tug of fruit he had not yet held, rounder than roots, willing to be scooped for welcome rather than for hunger. His ember lay steady in its little house, fed by nothing but attention. From far off, faint as a thought carried on water, a second glow answered his, higher, rounder, like a moon that had decided to come down and learn the manners of porches. He stood with the lantern cradled against his ribs, and let the two lights regard one another across distances and years, like cousins finding their family resemblance from opposite ends of a long table. The answering glow on the far side of distance did what all good kin do when they recognize one another. It did not rush, it did not insist. It kept its own shore and breathed in time with his, a slow pulse that made the dark feel less like a wall and more like a long hallway with windows. Jack cradled the root lantern and felt the coal's patience place its hand lightly over his earlier life, not to erase it, only to teach it a different ending. The bog's edge, which had so often behaved like a finish, now behaved like a margin where a letter grows a flourish. Reeds bowed, accepted, resumed their thin psalms. In the space between one owl's stitch of air and the next, the gentleman's nearness rose. No boot, no face, only that thin correctness that turns a knight honest, and stood with him the way a gate stands with a fence, not to forbid, to define. Do you feel it? The weather seemed to say, a question so courteous it could also be taken for approval. Jack did. He felt ships without names practicing in their sleep, the creak of rope that has learned the prayers of men who leave and return, the low murmur of wood deciding to be rowed. He felt, too, the rounder fruit rehearsing its own generosity in fields he had never stepped, vines dreaming of weight, skins learning the language of orange, seeds counting under their breath like monks who prefer gardening to argument. He did not pretend to know their names. He recognized their manners. Wind from the sea carried the room as insensible clothing, a tune foreign and friendly, the smell of tar and something like cinnamon, if cinnamon had wandered and learned humility. Laughter with a different cadence that still found the same end of the joke. Now and then, when the fog remembered how to part like a curtain caught by careful hands, he would see, no more than a suggestion, the idea of a lantern larger than a man's palm, its light rounder, its grin taught to children by older, steadier fingers. He did not feel replaced. He felt rhymed with. Down in the village, October began to tidy her apron. Doors one by one thanked their hinges and leaned into quiet. The last embers at the hilltops practiced being memory, which is a finer skill than brightness. Jack walked the seam a final time, tracing with his steps the parish's narrow geography of good manners, iron where needed, salt where needed, bread where needed, names always needed. At a certain hedge corner the seam opened by habit and showed him not the dead but the living who would one day leave. Young faces turned toward a horizon not yet drawn in ink, hands already practicing the weight of rope, pockets already forgetting to count coins and beginning to count miles. He let his lantern be a soft rehearsal on their cheeks and moved on. The watchtower accepted him for a seat, and the window accepted the route as a low star brought down for study. There he learned the sound ships make when no man is bragging, just the patient arithmetic of distance being solved with hull and hope. In that number, work, he heard an old lesson, great light for distance, small light for doors, translating itself across water, where great lights would become lighthouses and hearths on distant porches, and small lights would become little suns tucked into big, generous shells and given eyes and smiles to make courage easier for children. He laughed softly at the thought of children, exacting as angels and less patient, teaching their fathers how wide to cut a mouth so it looks brave but kind. Midway between watchtower and shore, he met the barman's wife walking with her shawl tight, a bundle of leftover bread on one arm, a quiet in her step that meant she had remembered someone kindly before sleep. She did not ask him for light. She already carried enough. He tipped the route anyway. They exchanged an orange nod, and the road added that small civility to its ledger of good debts. When he came to the green, the signpost stood like a ship's mast without the sea, proud of the roads it lifted. He set the lantern at its foot and listened, not for voices now, not even for knocking on panes, but for the deeper agreement that sometimes floats up when a place and a man have forgiven each other their old habits. It arrived as a change in temperature, more than sound, a mildness, the kind a kitchen knows after soup has chosen to be delicious without discussing it. Neither, he said once more to the air, neither gate he would be forced through, neither stamp on a ledger, and both, if both will have me. The gentleman's nearness thinned toward disappearance, pleased. Old weathers go quiet when the shape they wanted has been learned. Jack took up the lantern for home, and as he passed the widow's window, he saw, in the film that breath had left from the evening stew, the faintest lip of a circle someone had traced around without features, and then wiped it clean the way one cleans a plate before using it again. He paused, pressed his palm a moment to the cool glass, and went on, step calm as a tide. In his pocket, the iron cross lay agreeable as a tool between jobs. He thought of how his first cleverness had shrunk a coin and pinned a traveller, how his second cleverness had posted iron into bark and made a tree a gate, how his newest cleverness was no cleverness at all, only the willingness to carve hollows and not fill them with himself. That willingness, he understood now, could cross oceans without learning new words. In some far market, a turnip would look small beside a gourd that could mother a son. Knives would learn to move slower. Children would learn to ask for faces not too fierce for bedtime. And in all of it, the ember's old grammar, carry, don't clutch, welcome, don't trap, would be spoken clearly enough that even wind could nod. At his door, he did not linger. He set the root on the sill, let its breath warm the wood, and then took it gently inside, not as a trophy or award, but as a guest who had earned a chair. He banked his hearth with the same courtesy he had offered to lanes and names. Before sleep, he stepped once more to the threshold and looked down the road, and there, far beyond parish and sea, he thought he saw that other orange tilt slightly as if to bow. He bowed back, a man from a small green answering a fruit from a wide field, and in that exchange the night felt briefly like a bridge laid across years and water, two lights holding each other in mind, while the dark hummed its old, kind tune. The year turned its page without cracking the spine, and the parish learned a new quiet, the kind that comes when plans begin to loosen their knots. Down at the shore, ropes were coiled with more ceremony than usual, trunks nailed shut with prayers hidden under the lids, bread baked hard enough to remember the journey, and names rehearsed at tables so they would not be lost at the mouth of wind. Jack walked the lanes with the root lantern balanced in his palm and felt the village thinking in two directions at once, toward the fields that had always answered and toward a horizon that had only ever replied with weather. There were whispers of hard seasons, potatoes with their black sorrow, wages thin as a winter sun. And though such talk belonged to days men could count, it also belonged to nights, when the old seam at the hedge seemed to lean closer, as if the land itself wished to bless those who would carry its stories farther than the next parish. He did not advise anyone. Advice is a coin that buys more quarrels than comfort. He only let the small orange rinse the thresholds where goodbyes had already taken off their boots. Mothers stitched charms into seams without using the word charm. Fathers stood a long time looking at roofs they had mended and realized roofs can be mended again elsewhere. Children grave with the seriousness only children can wear without sweating, practiced the names of cousins they had not yet met across water. At the watchtower he set the root lantern where it liked to pretend at being a star, and below, in the patient dark, he could feel the harbour counting heartbeats, rope to timber, timber to water, water to moon, while the tide rehearsed, carrying weight as gently as a midwife. The gentleman's nearness came not as test, but as company, a correctness in the cold that made his breath tidy itself. Roads do not end at water. That weather suggested, courteous as ever. They translate. Jack looked past the black spoon of the harbour to where the ocean thickened into arithmetic no man could solve alone. He thought of the circle drawn in that older seam, the quint-sized glow and the barrel-hoop promise, and now a third circle arrived in his mind, big as a barn door and soft in the way fruit is soft when it has agreed to sweetness. He imagined fields that did not speak in furrows but in broad leaves, a green so confident it made its own shade, vines that held their own grammar of curl and clasp, and among them roundness upon roundness waiting to be emptied, not because hunger had asked, but because welcome had. The root lantern warmed his hand as if in agreement. On the green, the signpost stood like a mast for voyages mostly made with words. He lit it softly and moved on. He found himself standing more often at doorways where trunks waited, lids chalked with prayers disguised as initials. He learned the new etiquette of partings, bread broken without salt so that roads would not be jealous, a coal from the hearth wrapped in paper and given to a pocket so that one fire might remember another, a blessing whispered into the hollow of a spoon that would stir porridge far from home. He held the lantern so that its small room could hold those gestures without crowding them. Once, at the widow's, he arrived to find a circle of neighbours pretending they were not saying goodbye. They ate cleverly, laughing between spoonfuls, so that tears would feel outfoxed and go bother the geese. When at last words failed, he tipped the orange toward their faces, and something in the glow said what throats could not. Not the end, only the next porch. Later, on the quay, a ship side rose in the lantern's breath like a wall that had learned mercy. He ran his free hand along the tarred seams and felt, through pitch and oak, a tenderness that does not mind being called work. The sailors did not mock his odd light. Sailors know a thing that keeps company when the world forgets its edges. A girl with a shawl the colour of new peat took the root from his palm and cupped it as if listening to a shell. Her father nodded, a man who had already said what mattered by tucking his knife in his belt with the blade facing home. "Is it enough?" the girl asked, eyes on the small ember breathing in its carved hollow. "Enough," Jack said, and though he was not in the habit of promising, the word came honest. because enough in the dark is not measured by abundance but by trust. He watched as they found a place for the ember near a coil of rope and a crate of apples, trying their best not to bruise. He watched as a boy, taking his courage from her steadiness, traced a round in the air with his finger, as if he could already see the larger fruit his aunt had written from abroad, the one with ribs like a soft bell, and a skin that ripened to the colour of fires told to children. The gentleman's presence seemed to lean a forearm on the rail and look out too, amused at how journeys make teachers of people who never meant to lecture. Translate, the weather repeated, pleased with its lesson, not replace. Jack nodded. He thought of the root in his hand and its sly handle that had presented itself when the knife found patience. He thought of the gourd waiting elsewhere, generous enough to be carved by clumsier hands and still welcome a flame. He imagined nights on the other shore, where windows would learn new names for fog and hedges would reach out in unfamiliar shapes, and yet the old manners would fit. Iron where needed, salt where needed, bread where needed, and light in a small room to teach the dark its manners. When the tide bullied the ship away from the quay with all the kindness of a strong aunt shooing children, Jack lifted the root lantern in a salute that needed no flag. Faces leaned over the rail, brave, pale, stitched together by hope and rope, and somewhere among them the girl held up a glass jar where a stub of tallow would keep the ember honest until land remembered its duty. The jar winked with the exact humour of the watchtower window, which has always implied, I am not strong, but I am sturdy when asked. The ship's lanterns burned in their brackets, great lights for distance, but here and there along the stretch of deck, small humbler glows appeared. Cups, jars, a heel of hollowed beat, each a door made portable. He stayed until the dark swallowed the hull and left behind only punctuation marks of mast lights. Then he turned up the quay and found the lanes practising their emptiness. Emptiness can be cruel when it is new. This emptiness was not. It held the shape of people and waited. It folded the chairs and kept the names. He walked it with his orange and taught it the same patience the coal had taught him. Back at the bog's edge, the seam opened by courtesy and showed him the orchard of bells again, and the chapel that glowed without flame, and the lane with softer edges. There the figures nodded, not to say farewell, but to acknowledge the old trick of being in two places when two places rhyme. He did not linger. Even gifts grow tired if invited to perform. He set the root on the ash stump and listened to the sea adjust to one fewer hull and one more hope. Above the far water, faint but definite, something round and generous blushed, an answer he could not yet touch, bright as a promise, kept by hands he had not shaken. He lifted his lantern in quiet greeting, and the night, pleased with its own long hallway, breathed back. On the far side of water the land rose different and familiar, like a cousin whose face carries the old family mischief, but in a new arrangement. Fields spoke a broader dialect, rows of corn standing like listeners with spears lowered, woodlands built of trees that wore their leaves in islands of flame, and along the edges of farms a vine sprawled with a self-forgetful generosity, nursing roundness the size of a baby's cradle. Ships came up estuaries with their tarred lullabies and their cargo of names. The folk who stepped down from rope ladders felt the push in their backs of weather they had outlived, and the pull in their chests of bread they meant to bake anew. They brought iron quietly, nails that remembered the lips of hammers, and a thrift of salt, and spoons that had once learned porridge by heart. When October found them, she recognised their manners at once. She met them with a wind full of dried grass and wood smoke, and the tidy gold of fields that had been persuaded into harvest. On porches raised from stranger timber, extra chairs were turned toward doors. On thresholds newly learned by boot soles, a pinch of salt crusted the step, and in windows, late at night, the fog practiced other alphabets but made the same tender mistakes, scrawling half a letter and trusting someone inside would finish it and wipe it clean. Where the hedges would have been, in the old country, rails and snake fences took their place, and they too learned to be seams, at their margins the courteous, between opened and closed as needed, and on certain nights the air remembered, just as it had by the bog, how to thin without breaking. Jack walked there as easily as a word translates that was honest to begin with. He felt no ownership. He felt continuity, that quieter kinship that travels without a passport. His root lantern breathed its modest orange, and the night, this new night, with its raccoon cursive and its owl dialect, nodded in comprehension. He watched as the children of those who had crossed water learned a different fruit with the same old patience. Hands that had once hollowed turnips now steadied knives on pumpkins fat as moons fallen into fields. Mothers taught the trick of thin walls for breathing and thick enough for dignity. Fathers who pretended only to be practical cut smiles not too fierce for bedtime and then admired them longer than was strictly necessary. The first time a candle sat down inside a pumpkin, something ancient in the road agreed to the arrangement with relief. Great light for distance, small light for doors, and the faces carved in that soft, ribbed skin learned to be guardians with courtesy instead of teeth. Jack set his old, knotted root beside the new roundness and watched the two oranges converse without jealousy. One, a pilgrim cup, one a small sun. Porches lined themselves with borrowed constellations. Lanes, which were now more like tracks through generous yards, discovered they could carry light from step to step like a polite rumour. The seam between worlds arrived as politely as it ever had, not with pageantry, but with the feeling that thresholds had suddenly been taught their names. In its opening, there were not the graves of an old parish, but the first tidy stones of a place still learning where to keep its memory. The calm figures came as before, worn into forgiveness, all edges sanded by time, and they felt at home beneath maple and oak as once beneath you, because the manners had not changed. Invitation without grasping, remembrance without command. Somewhere in the new dark, the gentleman's nearness returned, not as a test, but as weather that has grown fond of a house, approving the way smoke finds its best way out and warmth its best way in. Translate, that cool courtesy breathed again, and the pumpkins smiled their agreeable grammar. On certain corners, where the wind liked to leave notes, boys began to wear masks cut from sackcloth or shaped from paste and paper, practicing the old bravery of borrowed faces. Girls solemn in shawls learned the ritual of knocking once, waiting and saying words that were half blessing and half joke. Doors opened with a clatter and a laugh. Bowls were presented like small edible benedictions, and thresholds felt themselves used properly, bridges, not walls. No one called this night by its old names loudly. They spoke it with bread, with lanterns, with patience. And yet because stories prefer to be accurate, even when they are kind, there were corners of mischief, gates quietly unhooked and left leaning like sleepy sentries, a string tied from doorknob to fence post for the startled education of a late walker, the gentle chaos of youths who need to feel the village, tolerate their rehearsal for bolder journeys. Jack's light had seen such things before and did not scold. It moved among them, like a chaperone who knows when to let laughter spend itself. He took the root lantern to a river bank that stood in for his old watchtower and let its glow face the water. Next to it, a pumpkin head kept its watch, wider of gaze but no less humble, and between them he heard the river speak the same arithmetic as the sea, carry, return, while from the far shore the faint blink of a ferry or a farmhouse answered, as a buoy once had. He thought of the widow's extra chair left long ago, and wondered whose chair in this new place would stand empty for kindness. He thought of the barman's third cup, and saw instead a mug of sweet cider steaming on a newel step. Iron worked here too, horseshoes above lintels, nails tidy in barrels. But it was bread and light that did the persuading. As the year practised being thin again, and frost embroidered porch rails with thread from the same winter that had once visited his bog, the pumpkins learned to wrinkle into a friendliness that had nothing to do with youth. Their smiles settled, and their walls, stained with candle breath, remembered how to host. Children, who carry tradition as casually as pockets carry marbles, began to walk house to house with their small sons and their paper masks, knocking once and waiting, brave and careful, while mothers and fathers learned to say, "Be good," and remember thanks, in a cadence that found new words and kept the old tune. Jack walked slightly ahead of them or slightly behind. Sometimes he was the draught that made a flame lean kindly, sometimes the calm that kept a porch from closing too soon. When he passed a window, the glass would fog a letter or two, not always the same, J or some cousin of J, or a circle beginning, as if the night were reminding itself that names and lanterns are both hollows, meant for careful filling. In the seam's polite opening, here a gap between fence rails, there the shadow beneath a persimmon, figures nodded as ever, willing to share the room made by steady orange, unwilling to own it. And on one porch, beneath a wreath braided from corn husk and red thread, a child in a borrowed mask lifted her pumpkin lantern toward the root he carried and whispered, with the authority only the young can make sound like prayer. "We match," he agreed, quietly, as one agrees to a vow. The gentleman's nearness thinned into satisfaction. The road, which now wore other dust, curled onward like a sentence that still had pleasant clauses to come. Near midnight, wind turned a page in the fields. Lanterns breathed like sleeping cats, and at the far end of a street lined with porches that were learning their trade, a small procession of masks and candles gathered itself like the beginning of a song, waiting for someone, anyone, to take the first step into the chorus of knocking and welcome. They came in little weathered capes and paper faces, in flour sack masks that smelled faintly of the cupboard, in shawls borrowed from mothers, and hats borrowed from grandfathers, a small parliament of dusk, with candles caged in pumpkins like tame sons. At the edge of each porch they paused, not because they feared to cross, but because someone had taught them to feel the seam. And in that stillness, Jack felt the year lean closer to listen. He kept to the gravel or the grass, where footsteps make honest sounds, the root lantern riding his palm like a quiet heart, and he watched how the children learned the old manners by rehearsal and delight. They knocked once the way a name is spoken carefully. They waited with the dignity of ambassadors from the kingdom of play, and when the door swung open and breath and lamplight met them, they offered words that were part blessing, part joke, their voices carrying the memory of porches far away where turnips had once stood in for moons. The pumpkins answered as elders do when they approve of youth, with smiles that did not sharpen to teeth, with eyes that held more welcome than warning. On one step, a boy whose paper mask had slumped in the damp looked as if he might lose his boldness, and with it his place in the small procession. Jack lifted the root a little, so the orange could kiss the pasteboard and warm the glue's forgotten courage, and the mask rose like a face remembering itself. remembering. On another, a girl in a blanket cape held her lantern too close to a seam, and the flame bruised the wall with a smoky thumbprint. He tilted the opening and taught her the law the coal had taught him, air enough to breathe, shelter enough to endure. And she took the lesson with the solemn gratitude children reserve for secrets they mean to guard. Behind them, the older ones practice mischief, or the way a river practices sparkle. Gate chains politely redistributed, a spool and string trick played at a window whose owner would laugh in the morning. Nothing cruel, nothing that would teach the night to close its hands. The parents waited at the path's turn, letting bravery be measured in door lengths. From their pockets came the rustle of apples, nuts, a wrapped sweet, edible affirmations that crossing and returning can be the same act if done with courtesy. At one house, a new family, raw from the road and not yet sure of the local grammar, opened their door with eyes like guarded lamps. Their porch wore a wreath of corn, husk shy of confidence. Their pumpkin's grin was an uncertain crescent, as if copied from memory. The children, ambassadors that they were, did not take advantage. They dipped their masks and spoke the old blessing as if it had always belonged here, as if porches were borders only, until a voice taught them their better job. The new faces softened. A bowl appeared. A chuckle remembered itself, and when the door closed again, the house seemed to stand on the street with more ease, as if it had been moved an inch closer to home without rolling a single wheel. Jack set his lantern on their step for a breath to season the wood, the way a first loaf seasons a new oven, then lifted it again and found the gentleman's nearness beside him, like a draught that has learned a house's corners. No test tonight, only a quiet pride, not the kind that asks for applause, the kind that knows when a custom has translated, when a hollow has found its rightful guest. Borrow, that cool presence seemed to murmur as a maple trembled overhead, scattering coins of flame. Return. And the children did. They were not hoarders of light, they were brokers of it. Door by door their pumpkins gathered a composite glow from candles politely shared, and at the last house they set their little sons together on the walk to make a brief constellation at foot level, a sky pressed down to where hands could learn its map. He saw then how the masks themselves, ridiculous, tender, grotesque in the way drawing is grotesque before it grows skilful, were a kind of lantern too, hollows cut in the daily face to make room for a bolder self, a safer self, to step through and ask for welcome. Behind some eye holes he glimpsed grief testing its boots. Behind others, the quick animal of joy. In all, the courage to knock and be answered. At a corner where the rail fence gave out and the field leaned in, the seam opened without fuss, as if it had been invited by the rhythm of steps. Figures gathered, not to startle, not to steal candy, but to watch with the patient affection of those who know why doorways matter. Someone's grandfather, he could not say whose, the edges were so kindly worn, lifted 2 fingers in the old blessing. Someone's lost aunt checked a child's scarf with a gesture remembered by muscle and fog alike. A dog that had belonged to a house no longer standing wandered among the ankles and found that it too had been expected. Jack held the root's modest orange low, so the 2 rooms, this side and that, could share a ceiling. The pumpkins, grinning down the block, did their broader work without envy. Great light for together, small light for come in. When the wind changed and the procession turned for home, some with hands sticky from sweetness, some with pockets chiming with nuts, all with faces softer under their masks, he lingered at the last gate to let the final candle settle its small arithmetic inside the gourd. The parents called, thank yous slung with yawns, the doors shut with the sleepy tact of houses that like their people. The street took back its darkness in courteous portions. He walked the length of it once more, straightening a pumpkin that had grown crooked with the laughing, dousing a wick that had done its work, relighting a timid flame so the last latecomer would not feel forgotten. At the end, where yards loosen into field and field rehearses forest, he set the root lantern on a post and rested his hands on the cool rail. Far off, beyond fences and water, and the mile-wide shoulder of years, he felt a kinlight answer, the rounder glow of cousins at their own doorways, bobbing on other streets under other stars. The gentleman's nearness faded to a comfort that did not need a name. Jack lifted the lantern once, a small sun agreeing with a larger, and the night, pleased with its borrowed faces and its shared flames, leaned in as if to whisper what comes next, while somewhere behind him a child's mask, forgotten on a step, filled softly with candle smell in October waiting to be found. Long after the masks were folded into drawers with the sweetness still clinging to their strings, long after porches forgot the names for the tricks and remembered only the laughter, October went on, not by date but by habit, and the lanterns kept breathing on sills as if they had learned to sleep with one eye open. Jack walked through this longer month as a man walks a familiar hymn, hearing in it new harmonies each time, the root lantern balanced in his palm, and the rounder cousins smiling from pumpkins where steps met doors. People asked, in their kitchens, in their letters crossing water, in the quiet counsel shared between neighbours who pretend to discuss weather, why the little rooms of light felt necessary even when the fields lay clean and the sea behaved itself. The answers came not as arguments but as chores, a wick trimmed properly so it learned the language of patience, a hollow cleaned and dried so it would not smoke its own hope, a handle checked for steadiness so the hand that carried it would not tire before the threshold. He saw that the lantern did what bread and names do. It made a place for belonging and asked nothing costly in return. In old lanes and new streets the same manners prevailed, iron where needed, salt where needed, bread where needed, and a low gold that taught darkness how to be a neighbour. The gentleman's nearness returned in these long evenings, not as test or lecture, but as weather that has come to trust a house. Sometimes Jack would feel a thread of cool along the brim of his hat, and know a quiet approval standing beside him, the sort that measures a man not by his cleverness, but by the courtesy of his carrying. Once at the seam, here a gap between bowls, where vine and fence had learned to share, he lifted the root while a family stood within arm's reach of one another, and said 3 names softly to the air. Nothing dramatic answered, only a mildness, a kitchen warmth among the leaves, and in that mildness the oldest woman in the circle breathed easier, as if the room had admitted her grief and set out a chair of its own. Another night, when wind argued with roofs and doors, he set his lantern on a sill in a cottage where a baby cried without reason, and the worn mother's hands had forgotten their calm. The orange gathered itself like a lullaby that remembers every verse, and the child, curious against its own will, paused long enough to meet the glow and learn for the first time that not all light hurries or demands. He began to understand the word enough in a way that had always been too small for him, enough light to cross a room without stubbing the soul, enough warmth to untie a knotted voice, enough presence to keep company with a name that is still learning to be gone. He saw too how the stinginess that once defined him had been less about coin and more about thresholds, how he had kept his doors shut, his bread unbroken, his chair turned inward. The lantern, modest and exact, had taught him the opposite grammar. Open, divide, turn toward. In parish talk, his legend browned at the edges, the way good crust does, stories told and retold, until the cleverness softened into usefulness. He heard himself called Stingy Jack by those who needed a cautionary smile in the telling, and he did not flinch, for there was truth enough in the name to keep him honest, and a further truth now to keep him kind. Across water, in towns where pumpkins stacked like small suns by the market fence, children repeated his tale with differences that felt like cousins. Some swore he had trapped the devil in a silver cross and made him swear off souls in exchange for a pint. Others had him climb a tree and cut a bargain among apples that remembered winter. In each version, the ending bent toward the same lesson, that a coal in a hollow is a way to go on when gates say neither and both, that generosity is a promise shaped like a door. On a late walk where Frost wrote careful script along the ditch, and the moon, thin as a paring, followed him without complaint, Jack paused on the old ash stump and set the root beside a pumpkin lantern someone had left as an afterthought. Their oranges met and made a small agreement, louder than either alone, and in that braided light he glimpsed the inward rooms of the world, as he had once seen them by the bog. The chapel that glowed without candle, the orchard ringing itself with bells. Only now those rooms had windows on to porches he did not know, and through each window a hand placed a cup, a crust, a coal. He did not need the gentleman to tell him the arithmetic. He could feel it working through him like bread through a hunger that has learned manners. Sometimes a house would knock from the inside, the way fog writes a name when stew has blushed the glass. He would trace the last shy letter with a knuckle, and then breathe the pain clean, so no one would be kept who wished to go. Sometimes a dog from a house no longer standing would slip into his circle, sigh once and step out again, as if the orange had reminded it of a child who called it once from a warm bed. Sometimes this was new. A traveller on the far road would lift a gourd lantern high and tilt it in a salute practised on other shores, and Jack, no longer embarrassed by belonging, would answer with the root, two kin lights acknowledging the miles between, and the rhyme that stitched them into something like a single town. He noticed, too, how the dark itself changed under such attention. It did not retreat in defeat. It chose to sit, to be a wall for light to lean on, to keep tender things hidden until they were ready to come to the table. In that tempering, children learned better jokes. Old men spoke shorter and truer, and widows' hands found restful places to fold. When mornings came pale and lawful, and the pumpkin slumped into a kindly old age, he carried the root to the river bank and let its coal breathe against the water's cool grammar. He tipped it once toward the far shore, where cousins he would never meet were teaching knives to be gentle, and once toward the seam in the hedge where those already forgiven still liked to pass, and then he walked home by the long way, the way that touches every gatepost and listens to every hinge. The legend was already taller than he was. It would go on walking when his steps gave out. He did not mind. He had wanted once to be admired. He wanted now to be useful, which is a better warmth and lasts the winter. On the last of these lengthened October nights, when frost had at last learned all the names of the leaves and began to practice them on roofs, he stood at the crossroads with the root lantern and felt, before any breath wrote it on any glass, the beginning of a word in the air, not a letter this time, but a spark of meaning gathering itself like a bird that meant to turn toward home. It began as a prickle in the air more than a sound, like wool catching on a splinter, like the memory of thunder without the sky to carry it, and Jack knew, as a man knows the weight of his own name, that the spark had something to say, not a blazer's proclamation, not a candle sermon, but a small, exact confession gathered from many nights walking the seam. He lifted the root lantern and let the orange sit where crossroads make their quiet cross, and in that patient circle the lessons of his long October behaved themselves and took their places. First came the matter of hollows, how a thing becomes useful not by what it keeps but by what it yields, how a turnip or a pumpkin or a man learns to be a room where warmth can live without debt. He saw, as if laid out on a pew, the old moments when his pockets had clutched and his door had turned inward, and how the coal, polite, persistent, had carved him open, the way a careful knife carves a shelter for a light. Then came thresholds, a sill salted for manners, iron set, where it does the least harm and the most good, bread left on a step because hunger is older than doctrine. He understood that a life now and then is not a walled house or a field with jealous fences, but a porch that remembers both weather and welcome, where the hinge is oiled because one hopes to hear it often. After thresholds came names, their soft arithmetic on glass, their refusal to be shouted, their preference for being completed and then freed. He remembered the fog writing not letters but permission, the way a breath drawn on a pane becomes a guest if the hand outside is patient, and how the kindest act is sometimes to wipe the slate so the visitor is not required to stay. He thought, too, of irons and bargains, and the professional politeness of winter. The iron cross rested quiet in his pocket, a tool between jobs. He turned it with 2 fingers, and felt how the metal had taught him shape, without bitterness, that there is a difference between binding and holding, between trapping and tending, that a tree will keep a man only as long as the lesson is needed, and then, if asked with courtesy, release him to walk on new feet. The gentleman's nearness answered that thought like a pale wind under a hat brim, not the old testing presence, and not quite absence either, more the composure of weather that has seen a roof be roof enough. You've learned to carry that cool approval suggested without words, and so the road has learned to trust you with its distances. Across water the cousin lanterns seemed to pulse in agreement, pumpkin suns on porches he would never climb, round faces cut by hands that had borrowed the old grammar and taught it new vowels. He pictured the children there, stern with joy, repeating the blessing that doubles as a joke. He pictured the fathers cutting a mouth not too fierce for bedtime, and the mothers teaching thin walls and steady wicks. It pleased him that none of those glows needed to remember him in order to rhyme with him. Usefulness is happier when it is anonymous. From the hedge came a rustle like paper that has travelled and returned with stamps he cannot read. The seam opened politely, and the calm figures gathered, not as chorus, not as jury, simply as kin who know the furniture of a room by touch. They passed their hands over the lantern's breath and let the heat instruct their palms. In their presence, he understood the last of it, the hardest of it, that mischief has its rightful corner so long as it harms nothing tender, that refusal is a virtue only when it protects a promise, that generosity must be measured like a carpenter's line, true and repeatable, not merely grand. He saw himself as he had been, a collector of quick wins, a master of the narrow, and felt no need to flinch. Shame had quieted into accuracy. Accuracy, in turn, had made room for gratitude. Stingy Jack, the story would keep calling him, in kitchens where dough rose and in lanes where masks waited their hour, and that was fitting. A name should carry the knot it ties. But under the knot, another thread had found its way, a man who learned to keep a coal for others, who discovered that the smallest light is also the most companionable, because it does not insist on being the only thing seen. He let the root lantern rest on the milestone. Frost gathered at its base like old lace, and the orange lifted that lace into minor summer. Roads went away from him in 4 directions, each remembering his steps without needing to own them. To the bog, where reeds keep psalms, to the watchtower that had liked his visits, to the green, where signposts pretend to be masts, to the shore that speaks arithmetic and salt. He understood that none of these ended. They translated the way customs do when they are honest, the way love does when it has nothing to prove. Somewhere, a window tapped with the faint knuckle of breath trying out a syllable. Somewhere an orchard dreamt again of bells. Somewhere far across the water, a child raised a pumpkin lantern and could not say why the night felt kinder, only that it did. Jack stood within the lantern's modest room and listened to the spark finish its thought. It did not flatter him with heroics. It did not frighten him with warnings. It said, as steadily as coals say yes to bread, that a life can be mended by attention and offered by habit, that a man may spend his days making doors where walls had been, and in so doing learn to walk through them last. The ember in his chest, which had once guarded its glow like a private grammar, answered now with the gentleness of a word that has found its sentence. He gathered up the root, felt its handle fit his palm, the way water fits its bed, and turned toward the lane that bends into the night's last corner. Behind him, the crossroads held their breath as rooms do when a tale nears its hinge. Ahead, where hedges blur into field, and field takes counsel with the wind, a softer darkness waited, the kind that does not ask for proof, only presence. And in that waiting, he sensed the final turn, the place where a flame that has walked so long may at last find what it has been saying all along to the dark that kept it company. The turn, when it came, was not dramatic. It was the soft hinge of a door that had been opened so often it learned to swing at the thought of a hand. Jack stood where lanes loosen into field, and field leans against the patient bog, the root lantern warm in his palm, a hush upon the world that sounded like bread cooling on a rack. The seam in the hedge was quiet, yet attentive, the way a friend listens from the other room, and the gentleman's nearness. No boot, no smile, only that thin correctness hovered like a draught that has finally forgiven the house. He felt not a summons, but a readiness, as if all the nights of carrying had been teaching the flame a word it could now say aloud without raising its voice. He set the lantern on the old ash stump that had always been a table for beginnings and endings, and watched the orange breathe into the bark's silver grain, as if reminding the wood that trees remember fire kindly when it is carefully kept. Around him, the parish assembled its quiet proofs. The watchtower window, now only an opening for wind that had found its manners. The signpost on the green, gaunt and steadfast, a mast for roads that never truly leave. The chapel stones holding the day's last cool like a folded cloth, the orchard beyond, bells invisible but tidy in their promise. And farther yet, the shore doing its patient arithmetic, setting out sums that end not in answers, but in tides. He did not look for letters on glass or faces in fog. He had been the pupil. He had had good teachers. Tonight the lesson stood up of its own accord. A hollow made honest is a room that anyone may pass through. A threshold admitted with bread and salt is a bridge that asks for no toll. A small light carried without pride persuades the dark to sit and listen rather than to clamour and conquer. The coal, which had learned his hand as he had learned its patience, gave one soft interior tick, like a clock deciding it could rest and still keep time. In that sound he heard the story's hinge. Stinginess turned to stewardship. Cleverness sanded down to care, the old habits of shutting retort as the new habits of opening. The gentleman's weather thinned with satisfaction, not as a departure, but as a blessing, withdrawing its hand, so the benedicted might walk unaided. Enough, that cool approval seemed to breathe, and the word did not mean little. It meant exact fitting at peace. Across water the cousin lanterns answered, round and amiable on porches he would never climb. He saw, without needing to see, their broad smiles teaching children the bravery of knocking, the father's clumsy knives making kind mouths, the mother's trimming wicks to the grammar of calm. He saw the long rhyme between turnip and pumpkin, bog and river, yew and maple, the way one hearth tells another, I know you, by sending on a coal wrapped in paper and promise. He lifted the root once more and walked the parish as men walk their thanks. Slow, thorough, naming nothing aloud and blessing everything. At the widow's, he paused and let the orange breathe on the chair that had taught him refusal could be a gift. At the barman's, his light kissed the lip of the third cup that had been kept out for the man who learned to bring warmth home. At the gate he had mended with twine, he touched the knot and found it still teaching modest lessons about holding without hurting. The seam in the hedge opened a respectful inch, and the calm figures gathered, less like an audience than like neighbours returning a borrowed pan. Hands passed over the glow, not to clutch, to confirm, a child among them, perhaps the one with the rowan sprig, perhaps another whose name the parish had not yet learned to say softly, leaned close and nodded, as if to say that rooms kept honest on this side are recognised on that. Jack did not ask for terms. He did not bargain. Seasons changed their clothes without contracts. He set the lantern at the crossroads last of all, where 4 ways make a chapel with no walls, and stood within its modest circle while the fog arranged itself like pews. The ember in his chest, once hoarded, matched its breath to the coals, and in that braided rhythm he felt tired in the correct way, the way roads intend, the way stories prefer, tired like a field after harvest that still keeps one sheaf standing for gratitude. He thanked silently the iron cross that had taught him the difference between trapping and keeping, the watchtower that had let him practice steadiness, the orchard that had lent him bells, the sea that had shown him how light travels by translation, not conquest. He thanked, too, the darkness for consenting to be companion instead of quarrel. And because some things deserve to be said, even in a tale that likes its pauses, he offered a whisper meant for those who had walked beside him unseen, and for those who had walked lantern in hand across oceans and years to find their own doorways. Thank you for the company, for the patience, for the careful carrying. May your thresholds be kind, your hollows honest, your embers exact. The wind, gracious in its old age, moved a single hair on his temple, and then was still. He gathered up the root by its sly handle, felt it fit like a last puzzle piece into a hand that had at last learned open, and stepped off the green with no grandness at all, only the attentive tread of a man leaving a room in order, sure of coming back whenever the road remembers his name. Behind him, the orange held the crossroads a moment longer, a small summer for late feet. Ahead, the lanes unrolled like pages that know the rest of the book, hedge to ditch, ditch to bog, bog to shore, while far away the rounder cousins breathed on porches, and a child somewhere traced a circle in window fog and smiled, and the night, pleased with the bargain it had made with kindness, drew its curtains softly, and kept a little gap at the edge, in case, in your own quiet, you should wish to slip through and walk with him a while.